In the opening years of the 14th century, you find yourself drifting through the winding streets of Paris, a city poised at the height of its medieval grandeur, its cobbled lanes alive with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, the smell of bread fresh from the oven, and the glint of sunlight upon the Seine as barges heavy with wine and wool float beneath the arches of stone bridges. France was then regarded as the jewel of Christendom, a kingdom wealthy in both land and culture, watched over by the formidable figure of King Philip IV, whose dominion stretched from the sunlit shores of the Mediterranean to the damp fields of Flanders. His was a reign that brought the monarchy to a height of power unmatched in Europe, and Paris itself, the king's chosen seat, shimmered with the symbols of that triumph. Its palaces and cathedrals rose proudly, their spires etched against the sky, while within their walls the machinery of royal authority churned ceaselessly, ensuring that no rival might challenge the hand of the monarch. Yet beneath this veneer of magnificence, the city carried whispers and currents that would, in time, converge into a storm capable of shaking the very foundations of that splendid realm. The king's palace, upon the Ile de la Cité, dominated the river's flow, a fortress of grey stone that bristled with towers, and was softened only by the painted glass of its chapel and the lush gardens enclosed within its walls. It was here that the daily life of the Capetian dynasty unfolded. Courtiers rustling in garments embroidered with gold thread, clerks bent over parchments, knights standing in polished armour beneath carved vaults, and noblewomen moving silently across marble floors, their eyes lowered, their thoughts carefully concealed. Around the palace clustered the growing might of the University of Paris, with its philosophers debating beneath vaulted cloisters, its students spilling into taverns, and its scholars illuminating manuscripts with patient devotion. The capital thus breathed both the fragrance of power and the murmur of intellect, a place where all of Europe looked for inspiration and guidance, and yet also for intrigue, for the grandeur of the French court inevitably attracted envy, resentment, and desire. At the heart of this radiant order stood Philip IV, known already in his own time as Le Bel, the Fair, though those who encountered him often discovered that the beauty of his features concealed a soul far sterner than his elegant form might suggest. Tall, broad-shouldered and pale, his face seemed carved from marble, his blue eyes cool as though untouched by human warmth, his lips thin and pressed together in an expression of perpetual judgment. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was as if a mask shifted briefly without changing the stone beneath. Yet it was precisely this austere detachment that allowed him to govern with relentless efficiency. He consolidated the administration of the kingdom, strengthened the role of legal institutions, and demanded from his subjects obedience that bordered on reverence. To those who crossed him, whether rebellious nobles, defiant popes, or even the once mighty Knights Templar, he was immovable, a monarch whose will seemed forged of iron. Thus, his court radiated an aura of majesty, but also one of fear, for beneath the gleam of ritual and ceremony lay a ruler who tolerated no weakness. The people of France, however, saw in him both protector and predator. To the peasant tilling his fields in Burgundy, the king's officials were distant but powerful figures who could levy taxes and summon men for war. To the merchant in Paris, the crown's patronage meant both opportunity and burden, for trade flourished under royal favour, even as tolls and tariffs weighed upon every sail. To the nobility, Philip's icy presence was both awe-inspiring and suffocating, for he demanded loyalty, yet offered little warmth in return. Still, the court glittered, for the monarchy was the axis around which all turned. Festivals illuminated the squares, tournaments filled the lists with colour and clamour, and the cathedral bells pealed endlessly, announcing both sacred rites and royal decrees. It was in such a world, steeped in ritual splendour, yet edged with unease, that the scandal soon to shake the dynasty began to take root. The royal family appeared, at least outwardly, as a tableau of stability. Queen Joan of Navarre, wife of Philip IV, shared his stern dignity, though she possessed a softer manner that lent grace to the court ceremonies. Together they had brought forth children who promised to secure the dynasty, sons who would in time inherit the throne, and daughters whose marriages would strengthen alliances with England and the Burgundian dukes. The three elder sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, were bound tightly by duty, their education overseen by stern tutors, their conduct moulded in the shadow of their father's rigid example. Each had been married to daughters of the powerful Duke of Burgundy, cementing bonds between two of Europe's most influential houses. On the surface, these unions glittered like the gilded reliquaries within the Sainte-Chapelle, symbols of dynastic order and royal foresight. Yet beneath that glitter lay disquiet, for marriages forged in politics rarely blossomed into harmony, and the chill of Philip's palace offered little warmth for young brides far from home. The court, as splendid as it appeared, functioned as a gilded cage. The noble women who inhabited it were adorned with silks, jewels, and the trappings of majesty, yet their lives were confined by ceaseless scrutiny. Every word spoken at table, every glance across the hall, every embroidery stitch undertaken in the ladies' chambers was noted, measured, and interpreted by servants, courtiers, and rivals. To stray beyond the rigid expectations of chastity and obedience was to court disaster, for the honor of the dynasty depended upon the virtue of its women as much as the valor of its men. Yet the same walls that constrained also fostered desire, for youth does not easily submit to silence. The laughter of minstrels, the scent of summer gardens, the sight of young knights practicing in the lists, these could ignite fires of longing that etiquette sought to smother. It was in this paradox, this tension between splendor and suffocation, that the threads of scandal began to weave themselves into the tapestry of the Capetian court. As you drift further into the palace, you notice the rhythms of life, slow yet heavy with unspoken undercurrents. The great halls resound with the shuffle of feet as petitioners seek royal judgment. The council chambers echo with the Latin of lawyers and the clink of coin as taxes are tallied. The chapels hum with psalms, their incense rising like mist. Outside, the river reflects the torches of the night watch, and the moonlight glints off the rooftops of Paris. All appears calm, a kingdom secure, a dynasty unshaken, yet you sense, as if beneath the very stones, the faint quiver of unrest. For splendor, however dazzling, cannot forever conceal the frailty of human hearts, nor prevent the whispers that pass from lip to lip, carrying tales of desire, of betrayal, and of shame. Soon, this kingdom of shimmering splendor will find itself consumed not by armies or famine, but by scandal born in the most private chambers of its rulers. You find yourself now in the quiet chambers of the French king, where the glow of candlelight flickers upon stone walls hung with rich tapestries depicting saints and battles, where silence reigns so completely that the soft crackle of a fire seems loud as a drum. Here, Philip IV, called the Fair, passes the hours of his rule, not with laughter or music, but with documents, seals, and the stern presence of advisers who dare not meet his gaze for long. To those who beheld him, Philip was more than a sovereign. He was an embodiment of the monarchy itself, an image as immovable as marble. His beauty was admired throughout Europe, yet it was a beauty devoid of warmth. His long limbs carried him with the dignity of a statue brought to life. His pale face remained composed in all circumstances, and his piercing eyes seemed to see not men and women, but pawns and counters upon a board of destiny. He had been shaped by a childhood touched by loss, by the early death of his parents, and by the heavy expectation of inheriting a kingdom that demanded strength. From the moment he ascended the throne in 1285, he ruled not with the heart of a man, but with the cold determination of an institution. Philip's contemporaries whispered of his demeanor, noting how rarely he spoke, and how, when he did, his words fell with the weight of judgment. He was not a king who delighted in banquets, or who sought the company of poets and troubadours. Instead, he embodied the law itself, preferring the company of jurists, accountants, and clerks, who recorded every transaction of his expanding state. He was relentless in centralizing power, binding the feudal nobility more closely to the crown, extending royal justice into regions once governed by local custom, and ensuring that the treasury remained full to support the grandeur of the monarchy. In an age when many monarchs seemed half warrior, half feudal lord, Philip was something different, a ruler who believed in the sovereignty of the state itself, a king whose hand weighed upon every aspect of his kingdom, from the levying of taxes to the punishment of crime. It was this firmness, this unwillingness to compromise, that earned him the sobriquet of the Iron Hand. And yet, for all his power, there was something chilling in his presence, as though a man had set aside all softness in order to become a machine of government. His reign was marked by great struggles, and each revealed the iron quality of his character. With the papacy, he waged a battle of wills, refusing to allow the Pope to interfere in the financial or political affairs of France. When Pope Boniface VIII issued bulls asserting the supremacy of spiritual authority over kings, Philip answered not with deference but with defiance, sending his agents even to the papal court, and in the end, humbling the pontiff. The clash shook Christendom, for never before had a king stood so boldly against the Vicar of Christ, and the result was the relocation of the papacy itself to Avignon, a sign of how deeply Philip's hand pressed upon the world. With the Knights Templar, he was equally ruthless. Once the guardians of Jerusalem, the Templars had grown rich and powerful, and Philip, ever hungry for revenue to fund his wars, accused them of heresy, corruption, and unspeakable sins. In a series of orchestrated arrests, the order was shattered, its leaders tortured and burned, its wealth seized by the crown. Some said it was greed, others said it was justice, yet all agreed that no man could stand against the will of the Iron King. Yet if his political strength was beyond question, his personal life was less easily controlled. Though married to Queen Joan of Navarre, whose dignity matched his own, Philip was not a man known for tenderness or intimacy. His household, for all its pageantry, was a place of chill formality, where children approached their father with trepidation, and where courtiers measured their words as though every syllable might cost them their fortunes. His sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, grew up not in the embrace of a nurturing parent, but under the stern gaze of a monarch who expected obedience. Each boy learned to wear a mask, to conceal his feelings, to bow without question, for the king's approval was rare and his disapproval swift. His daughters, too, felt the weight of his expectations, for every marriage was a matter of state, every gesture a signal of France's alliances. It was within this cold atmosphere that the seeds of rebellion and desire began to stir, though none could yet foresee the scandal that would one day explode. What made Philip so formidable was not only his authority, but also the aura he cast over all who entered his presence. Chroniclers described him as terrifying in his silence, a man whose eyes froze conversation, whose very stillness commanded respect. He was likened to a lion at rest, silent yet dangerous, a monarch who could devastate his foes with a single decree. His court, therefore, became a place of calculation rather than joy, a place where courtiers advanced by careful service, where ministers handled the machinery of state with the same precision as cogs in a wheel, and where women, though adorned in finery, were expected to uphold the dignity of the dynasty with impeccable chastity. To serve Philip IV was to live beneath a constant shadow, a shadow of iron, under which every gesture carried the weight of law. And yet, beneath the surface of his power, Philip was not immune to the forces of fate. Those who opposed him believed that his downfall had been foretold, that when Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was burned alive on the Allée de la Cité in 1314, he pronounced a curse upon the king and his heirs, summoning them before the judgment of God within a year. Indeed, Philip himself would die within that span, and one by one his sons would follow him, their reigns short and troubled. Whether curse or coincidence, it lent to Philip's memory an aura of tragedy, as though his iron hand, though powerful, had gripped too tightly, cracking the very foundations of the dynasty he sought to preserve. As you watch him move through the vast halls of his palace, you sense the contradictions that defined his reign. Here was a man who strengthened the crown, who humbled popes and orders, who made France the most powerful kingdom of its age, and yet who sowed the seeds of weakness by suffocating the humanity of his own household. His daughters-in-law, married into the Capetian family, found themselves within a court of icy formality, where affection was scarce and companionship limited, where the brilliance of jewels could not soften the rigidity of life. His sons, heirs to thrones, grew restless beneath the weight of expectations, and in this rigid world, where the king's hand closed around all like iron, the smallest crack in the surface of virtue would grow into a fissure capable of bringing the dynasty to ruin. The Iron King had built a fortress of law and majesty, but within its walls, human longing whispered, waiting for a moment to escape. Within the shadowed corridors of the Capetian palace, the lives of women unfolded with an elegance that belied their confinement. For in a world ruled by men and shaped by dynastic ambition, queens and princesses were both treasured ornaments and silent prisoners. The queen herself, Joan of Navarre, carried her role with quiet dignity. A woman of noble lineage whose marriage to Philip IV had joined her inheritance of Navarre and Champagne to the power of France, she possessed a steadier warmth than her husband, though her manner was restrained, for in the solemn climate of Philip's court, even gentleness had to clothe itself in gravity. Chroniclers would later remember her as loyal and reserved, a queen who upheld her duties faithfully, who accompanied the king on journeys and lent her presence to ceremonies, yet whose inner life remained veiled behind the courtesy of a monarch's consort. She shared her husband's cold grandeur in public, though one suspects that in private, her heart yearned for a measure of tenderness that never quite arrived. Around her gathered the younger women of the dynasty, each with their own story, each drawn from powerful noble families into the glittering but perilous orbit of the French crown. Chief among them were the princesses by marriage, daughters of Robert II, Duke of Burgundy, whose alliances with France were sealed in unions designed less for love than for the tightening of political bonds. Margaret of Burgundy, spirited and beautiful, had been wed to the eldest son, Louis, a prince destined one day to rule as Louis X. Blanche of Burgundy, gentle and youthful, became the wife of Charles, the youngest son. Joan of Burgundy, clever and self-possessed, was matched with Philip, the middle son, who bore the same name as his father. Together, the three young women entered a court glittering with splendor, only to discover that their golden cage offered little companionship and even less freedom. Margaret of Burgundy, married to the heir apparent, found herself in the most exalted position of the trio, her future as queen assured once Louis ascended the throne. Yet her marriage was shadowed by her husband's brutish and impetuous nature. Louis, though born to inherit his father's iron crown, lacked the reserve and icy dignity of Philip IV. He was hot-tempered, impatient, given to pleasure, and careless in his dealings with others. Margaret, fiery in her own way, clashed with him, their union marked not by harmony but by outbursts and resentments. At court, she glittered in jewels and silks, a figure of beauty admired by many, but behind her eyes flickered a restlessness that could not be entirely concealed. Blanche, the youngest of the three, was more timid, more inclined to docility, and in her union with Charles she found little comfort. Charles, awkward and moody, possessed neither the charm of his brother Louis nor the stern intellect of Philip. He was sullen, prone to jealousy, and suspicious even of affection. For Blanche, life within the court was one of quiet endurance, of soft words and lowered eyes, of seeking solace in embroidery and prayer, while her husband's mistrust cast long shadows upon her days. She was delicate in appearance, with pale skin and soft features, yet within her perhaps grew the silent ache of a woman unfulfilled in both companionship and respect. Joan, wife of Philip the Tall, was of a different nature altogether. Intelligent, composed, and keenly aware of the political world around her, she seemed best suited to the cold atmosphere of the Capetian palace. Her husband, though less volatile than Louis and less insecure than Charles, shared the family's stern reserve, and in Joan he found a partner capable of managing her role with grace. She adapted to her new life with sharpness of mind, cultivating alliances and learning the intricacies of court etiquette. It would later be said that her conduct was far less scandalous than her sisters-in-law's, and indeed she would emerge from the storm that engulfed the others with her position largely intact. Yet even she lived beneath constant scrutiny, for in this court no woman was free from the burden of expectation. The daily life of these women was bound by ritual. They rose at dawn to the tolling of bells, attended mass in the royal chapel, and passed their mornings in the company of ladies in waiting, sewing, reading psalters, or discussing the minutiae of fashion. Meals were taken in grand halls, where every bite and every glance was witnessed by dozens of eyes, and afternoons were filled with ceremonies, receptions of ambassadors, and processions through the city streets. Their evenings unfolded beneath the watchful gaze of courtiers, their laughter constrained by the weight of etiquette, their desires stifled beneath layers of silk and velvet. To be a princess of France was to embody virtue itself, for the reputation of the dynasty rested heavily upon their shoulders. The slightest hint of impropriety, the faintest shadow of scandal, could ignite rumors that would spread like wildfire across Christendom. Yet these women, though bound in gold, were still young. Margaret, Blanche, and Joan were in the bloom of youth, scarcely out of their teens when their marriages were arranged, and they carried within them the longings of their age. The sight of knights practicing in the tilt-yard, the gallantry of courtiers at feasts, the tender songs of minstrels singing of forbidden love, such sights and sounds stirred feelings that could not be easily extinguished. The rigid walls of Philip's palace could suppress desire, but they could not eradicate it. The Queen herself may have offered counsel and example, reminding them that duty outweighed passion, that honour must be preserved above all else. Yet even Joan of Navarre could not entirely shield them from the currents that swept through the court. The court was, after all, a place of ceaseless movement, where foreign ambassadors arrived with retinues of knights, where tournaments brought together the flower of French chivalry, where hunts carried noblemen and women into forests, alive with the thrill of the chase. It was in such settings that glances might be exchanged, that conversations might drift toward intimacy, that silken purses might change hands as tokens of affection. Though the court projected the image of order and sanctity, it was also a stage upon which private dramas played out beneath the eyes of hundreds. And in that stage, hidden within gestures that seemed innocent to most, were sown the seeds of one of the greatest scandals Europe would ever know. For now, however, the princesses maintained their place within the glittering order, their beauty adorning the ceremonies of the crown, their smiles concealing the whispers of their hearts. Margaret, restless and bold; Blanche, timid and sorrowful; Joan, shrewd and careful. All three walked daily within halls that demanded perfection, and yet all three would soon be touched by events that shattered the illusion of purity. Their lives, so entwined with the destiny of the crown, would soon become the focus of judgment, shame, and punishment. Their names carried across Christendom in tales of sin and disgrace. But in these years before the storm broke, they were simply young women navigating the treacherous currents of life at court, queens-to-be, duchesses, princesses, wives, each a symbol of dynastic hope, each unknowingly stepping closer to the precipice that awaited them. In the solemn expanse of the royal palace, the sons of Philip IV grew to manhood, not in laughter and ease, but under the heavy shadow of their father's iron presence. Each boy carried within him the weight of dynasty, the burden of an expectation carved into the very stone of the kingdom itself. Louis, the eldest, was destined from birth to inherit the throne, his every step observed, his every word measured against the image of kingship that his father embodied. Behind him followed Philip, tall and deliberate, the second son, whose prospects were less certain yet still bound to the web of dynastic alliances. Last came Charles, the youngest, whose life seemed from the beginning one of secondary importance, and yet whose fate would, like his brother's, carry him toward the crown. Together, they were the future of the Capetians, the continuation of a line that had reigned over France for centuries. Yet, beneath their gilded titles, they were young men, each with his own temper, each struggling beneath the cold hand of a father who demanded obedience but rarely offered affection. Louis, who would one day be known as Louis X, carried the boldness and recklessness of a spirit less restrained than his father's. He was quick to anger, prone to rash decisions, and inclined to seek pleasure without care for consequence. While Philip IV's silence could strike fear into courtiers, Louis's voice often filled halls with demands and outbursts. He rode with vigour, fought with ferocity, but governed with little patience for nuance. Those who watched him saw a prince who was both strong and weak, strong in his will, weak in his self-control. To his wife, Margaret of Burgundy, he offered little constancy, for his attentions wandered, and his temper made their marriage a battlefield. Yet as the heir, he carried within him the aura of destiny, and even his faults were tolerated, for soon enough the crown would rest upon his brow, and the kingdom would bow before him whether it willed or not. Philip, the second son, known later as Philip the Tall, bore more of his father's gravity. He was serious, cautious, and deliberate in speech. Where Louis was hot-blooded, Philip was calculating. Where Louis sought pleasure, Philip sought order. Of the three, he seemed best suited to the demands of kingship, though his path to the throne was less clear. His marriage to Joan of Burgundy provided him with a capable partner, for she shared his composure and intelligence, and together they navigated the court's intrigues with careful steps. Philip inherited his father's preference for law and administration, and though he lacked the Iron King's terrifying presence, he carried within him a similar devotion to authority. Yet even he was not immune to frustration, for as the second son, his destiny was uncertain, his authority limited, and his ambitions constrained by the fact that the crown would not naturally fall to him unless fate intervened. Charles, the youngest, lingered always in the shadow of his brothers. He was less handsome, less commanding, more awkward in manner, and more sensitive to slight. His marriage to Blanche of Burgundy offered him little joy, for his suspicions and jealousies gnawed at any chance of harmony. While Louis and Philip at least carried the confidence of knowing their roles, Charles seemed adrift, his path shaped less by his own will than by the designs of others. Yet in the strange turn of destiny, even Charles would one day wear the crown, though his reign would be brief and troubled. His youth at court was marked by insecurity, and his interactions with others often revealed the bitterness of one who felt overlooked. This bitterness, simmering quietly, would shape his actions when fortune or misfortune lifted him to the throne. Together, the three sons represented both the hope and the peril of the dynasty. Their upbringing under Philip IV was strict, almost suffocating. They were taught to respect the rituals of monarchy, to honor the majesty of the crown, and to serve as living symbols of royal authority. Yet their father's distance deprived them of the warmth that might have fostered unity among them. They grew into men who did not love one another deeply, but who tolerated each other for the sake of duty. Their rivalries, though muted, simmered beneath the surface, and the coldness of their father's example left them ill-prepared for the betrayals that would soon strike at the heart of their household. The three brothers shared one burden above all others: the unyielding expectations of their father. Philip IV had little patience for weakness, and his standards were impossibly high. To falter in judgment was to earn his displeasure. To fail in discipline was to suffer his rebuke. He had built his reign upon control, and he demanded nothing less from his sons. Yet his rigidity left no room for affection, no space for error, and thus the young men grew not as confident heirs nurtured by love, but as anxious inheritors weighed down by judgment. Their marriages, designed to strengthen the crown, offered little solace, for the unions were made not for companionship, but for alliance. Each son lived in a kind of loneliness, even when surrounded by courtiers and wives, and each sought in his own way to escape that loneliness. Louis through pleasure, Philip through authority, Charles through suspicion. As the years passed, their roles crystallized. Louis prepared for kingship with impatience, eager to assume power and free himself from his father's dominance. Philip watched closely, measuring the failures of his elder brother, perhaps already imagining that fate might one day place the crown upon his own head. Charles lingered uneasily, resentful of his insignificance, yet secretly longing for a chance to prove himself. They attended tournaments together, sat beside one another at feasts, and prayed in the royal chapel, their faces solemn beneath candlelight. Outwardly, they embodied the unity of the dynasty, three princes destined to carry on the Capetian line. Inwardly, they were bound by little more than duty, their hearts restless, their tempers unsteady, their destinies uncertain. In the court of Philip IV, these princes appeared as the embodiment of continuity, the assurance that the dynasty would endure. Yet to those who looked more closely, the cracks were already visible. Louis lacked the restraint of a true ruler. Philip possessed the intelligence but not the charisma of his father. Charles, overshadowed and embittered, seemed unfit for leadership, and above them all loomed the Iron King, a man of marble who had given them everything except the tenderness that might have bound them together. It was this absence, this void of affection, that would soon leave them vulnerable, for when scandal struck, when their wives were accused of betrayal, they would find themselves not united but isolated, each struggling with shame in his own way. And so the sons of Philip IV walked daily through the halls of the palace, their steps echoing against stone, their faces illuminated by torchlight, their destinies bound to crowns they scarcely understood. The people of France looked upon them with pride, believing the dynasty secure for generations to come. Yet history, waiting quietly in the shadows, knew otherwise. For these three sons, heirs of a stern father, would each in turn wear the crown, only to pass it quickly to the next, their reigns consumed by misfortune, their dynasty brought to ruin by scandal and fate. The grandeur of their heritage could not shield them from the frailty of their lives, nor from the storm already gathering in silence around them. The marriages of the Capetian princes were celebrated with feasts, with banners unfurled across the streets of Paris, with the tolling of cathedral bells that rang through the air as if heaven itself approved. Chroniclers describe these weddings as splendid events, filled with processions of noblemen on richly caparisoned horses, with fountains flowing with wine, with tables groaning under the weight of roasted boar and spiced pastries. Yet for all their magnificence, these marriages were never unions of hearts. They were contracts written upon flesh and bound by the seal of dynastic ambition. At their core, they were alliances, links in a chain that stretched across Europe, joining Burgundy and France in a web of power. Each young woman, Margaret, Blanche and Joan, entered her marriage with expectation heavy upon her shoulders, expectation that she would produce heirs, secure loyalty, and embody the virtue of the dynasty. Each prince, in turn, viewed his marriage less as companionship than as duty, and thus the cage was gilded, glittering with jewels and ceremony, but a cage nonetheless, confining them all. Louis, married to Margaret, bore the burden of the greatest expectation. As heir to the throne, his marriage was a matter of state, a bond that ensured the support of Burgundy for generations to come. Margaret, lively and beautiful, entered the union with the pride of her house, but quickly discovered the volatility of her husband's nature. Louis was restless, fond of hunting, drinking, and the pleasures of the body, and though he acknowledged Margaret as his wife, he did not treat her as a partner. Their relationship was turbulent, filled with quarrels, reconciliations, and further quarrels, a storm contained within the gilded chambers of the palace. To the court, they appeared a handsome couple, but behind the veil of ceremony, Margaret grew resentful of the neglect she suffered, and Louis grew weary of her reproaches. It was a union bound by law but divided by temperament, a bond that looked strong on the outside yet cracked beneath the weight of dissatisfaction. Philip the Tall, though the second son, fared somewhat better in his union with Joan of Burgundy. Joan was intelligent and pragmatic, capable of navigating the cold formality of the Capetian court with a composure that rivaled her husband's. Their marriage, though hardly filled with passion, was stable. They treated each other as partners in governance, allies in ambition. Together they cultivated an image of dignity, and together they weathered the formality of the royal household with patience. Yet even here, affection was limited. Theirs was a marriage of reason rather than love. The bond gave Philip confidence and stability, but it could not shield him entirely from the scandal that would one day engulf his sisters-in-law and taint even his reputation by association. For though Joan herself was never truly accused of betrayal, she could not entirely escape the shadow cast by her kin. Charles, the youngest, found his marriage to Blanche of Burgundy the most fragile of all. Charles himself was awkward, quick to jealousy, uncertain of his own worth, and Blanche, delicate and youthful, struggled to endure his moods. Their union produced little joy, and Blanche, lonely in the cold palace, found herself yearning for warmth, for companionship, for a tenderness absent in her husband's company. Charles's suspicion, his tendency to brood, created a marriage of silences and reproaches, a household where mistrust lingered like smoke. Though Blanche sought solace in prayer and piety, her heart remained restless, her eyes perhaps drawn to the gallantry of knights whose presence at court contrasted starkly with the coldness of her spouse. It was within such a marriage, hollowed of affection, that temptation could take root. These unions, glittering in the eyes of the world, were brittle within. The court saw the jewels, the silks, the procession of heirs and alliances, but behind closed doors The princesses endured loneliness, frustration, and neglect. They embroidered silk purses not only for fashion but to pass the hours. They walked in gardens not only for leisure but to seek a breath of freedom. They whispered in private not only to converse but to confide the restlessness of their souls. Each woman, though bound by duty, longed for something more. Margaret for recognition, Blanche for affection, Joan for purpose, and each man, though charged with upholding the dynasty, fell short in providing what his wife required. Louis too hot-blooded, Charles too jealous, Philip too detached. The marriages revealed the paradox of royal life. To the world, they embodied strength, the merging of powerful houses, the assurance of dynastic continuity. Yet within, they were fragile arrangements, cracks forming slowly beneath the surface, invisible to the eyes of ambassadors and chroniclers, but all too visible to the hearts of those trapped within them. These cracks would widen in the years to come, as desire found its way into the cold chambers of the palace, as whispers spread, as gestures of affection strayed beyond the boundaries of marriage. What began as boredom and longing would grow into scandal, a scandal so great that it would shake not only the marriages themselves, but the very foundations of the French monarchy. For now, though, the court celebrated these unions as triumphs. Tournaments were held in their honor, poets composed verses praising the beauty of the princesses, and gifts flowed between Burgundy and France, sealing the alliance with every exchange of gold and silver. The Capetian dynasty, secure in its power, presented to the world an image of harmony, of order, of families united by duty and crowned by majesty. Yet you, looking closer, can see the shadows that cling to the edges of the tapestry. The cage glitters, but its bars remain, and within its confines hearts beat restlessly, longing for a freedom they cannot claim. The Capetian palace, so heavy with formality and so carefully ordered by ritual, could not silence entirely the murmurs that passed in its corridors, the secrets exchanged in corners, or the sighs that fluttered behind embroidered drapes. Court life was dazzling on its surface. Banquets illuminated by chandeliers dripping with wax, long tables laden with meats glazed in honey, and platters of gilded fruits, and musicians filling the air with the strains of viols and flutes. Nobles in silks and furs paraded through the halls, courtiers jostled for favor, and knights, their spurs gleaming, paid obeisance to their royal patrons. It was a world designed to impress ambassadors and intimidate rivals, to project the majesty of France as the jewel of Europe. Yet beneath this grand facade, hearts beat with more private desires, and whispers lingered where candlelight fell dim. The young princesses, Margaret, Blanche, and Joan, moved through this world like precious ornaments, their gowns sewn with pearls, their hair braided with ribbons of gold. They sat at banquets beside their husbands, attended masses beneath the soaring arches of the Sainte-Chapelle, and walked through gardens where fountains sparkled in the sunlight. To all appearances, they fulfilled their roles perfectly, embodiments of royal virtue. Yet those who watched more closely might have seen the fleeting glances, the quickened breath, the faint smiles shared not only with husbands but with others. Youth, after all, is not easily confined, and even behind the rigid etiquette of the Capetian court, sparks of longing could ignite. It was during tournaments, above all, that the air seemed most alive with possibility. In the lists outside Paris, knights charged with lances lowered, their shields painted with coats of arms, their horses adorned with caparisons of silk. The crowd roared, ladies waved kerchiefs, and the princes themselves sometimes took part, showing their valor in the field. For the princesses, seated in pavilions draped in fine cloth, it was a spectacle of gallantry. Knights rode for their honor, dedicated their triumphs to their chosen ladies, and laid trophies at their feet. It was here, amid the clash of steel and the cries of victory, that eyes might meet, that admiration might blossom into something more. And it was here that whispers began to stir, whispers of attentions paid too boldly, of gifts exchanged too privately, of tokens that lingered in hands longer than courtesy demanded. Within the palace itself, evenings often brought more intimate gatherings. After the feasts, when the halls emptied and the torches burned low, smaller circles gathered in chambers adorned with silk drapes and cushions embroidered with fleur-de-lis. Minstrels sang ballads of love and betrayal, their verses both entertaining and dangerous, for they spoke of knights who adored ladies beyond their reach, of queens who defied their husbands, of secret meetings in gardens beneath the moonlight. The company laughed, applauded, and demanded more, yet within each song lurked a mirror of possibility. Did not these very walls shelter young women who might dream of more than duty? Did not these very halls echo with the footsteps of knights who might, in turn, be tempted? It was in such moments that the dangerous chemistry of court life revealed itself. The women, bound by marriages that offered little affection, longed for warmth and admiration. The knights, sworn to service, yearned for intimacy beyond the rigid codes of fealty. And all the while, the court watched, gossiping in half-spoken words, their suspicions carried like sparks along dry straw. Servants noticed when a purse embroidered by a princess found its way into the hands of a knight. Ladies-in-waiting whispered when glances lingered too long at feasts. Even the guards stationed at doors observed comings and goings with curiosity. Nothing escaped the eyes of the court, though much was spoken in hushed tones rather than openly. Paris itself, always alive with rumour, seemed to magnify these whispers. In taverns near the palace, gossipers claimed to know the secrets of the royal household. Merchants who delivered silks and jewels to the court spoke of intrigues glimpsed in passing. Students of the university, ever eager for scandal, repeated tales of princesses whose smiles concealed forbidden affections. Though much of it was speculation, the persistence of the rumours suggested that something more than mere fancy was at play. And yet, for the moment, the scandal remained hidden, a shadow behind the silk drapes, known only to those who dared to look closely. What made these whispers so dangerous was the nature of the dynasty itself. The Capetians prided themselves on order, on majesty, on an image of purity and virtue that distinguished them from lesser nobles. To question the chastity of the princesses was to question the legitimacy of heirs, to cast doubt upon the very succession of the crown. Thus the stakes were higher than in any ordinary household. What might elsewhere have been dismissed as folly or youthful indiscretion here became treason against the stability of the realm. And though the king himself remained unaware, or perhaps chose for a time not to see, the murmurs were already circling, gathering momentum, preparing to burst forth into revelation. The women themselves, caught between duty and desire, must have felt the tension daily. Margaret, restless and bold, perhaps chafed most against the confines of her marriage, her spirit too lively to be extinguished by Louis's neglect. Blanche, timid and sorrowful, may have been drawn to kindness where she found it, even if it lay outside the bonds of her union. Joan, careful and composed, balanced her instincts with caution, sensing the dangers of impropriety, yet not entirely immune to its temptations. Together, they embroidered, prayed, and performed their roles, but in quiet moments they perhaps allowed themselves the smallest of freedoms, a smile, a token, a meeting too easily overlooked, and in these smallest of gestures lay the seeds of catastrophe. For now, though, the court glittered on, the whispers still faint, the scandal still hidden. The silk drapes swayed softly in the breeze, the torches flickered, the music of minstrels rose and fell, and the palace seemed as unshakable as ever. Yet beneath the surface, desire and suspicion wove their subtle threads, unseen but unstoppable, drawing closer to the day when whispers would become accusations, and accusations would ignite a scandal that would resound across Europe. Far across the Channel, in the damp halls of Westminster, lived another daughter of Philip IV, Isabella of France, the she-wolf of France, as later generations would call her, though in these years she was still a young queen, her face fair, her demeanour composed, and her eyes sharper than most ever realised. Married to Edward II of England, Isabella's life was shaped by alliances no less political than those of her sisters-in-law. Her marriage had bound France and England together, at least in theory, but her life as queen was not a happy one. Edward, more devoted to his favourites than to his wife, left Isabella feeling sidelined, her influence diminished, her dignity bruised. She had learned quickly that to survive, she must be both silent and perceptive, outwardly dutiful but inwardly calculating. From childhood, Isabella had absorbed the stern lessons of her father's court, where silence was strength and keen observation the surest weapon. Thus, though still young, she possessed a mind as sharp as a blade and a gaze that missed nothing. It was in the year 1313, during a grand visit to France, that Isabella's watchful eyes set the course of scandal. Edward and Isabella had crossed the Channel to attend festivities hosted by her father, King Philip IV. Paris was alive with celebration, for the occasion marked not only the presence of the English royals, but also the ongoing display of Capetian magnificence. Tournaments were held, banquets filled the halls with laughter, and the royal family appeared united in splendor. It was during these days of festivity, amid the rustle of gowns and the shimmer of jewels, that Isabella's keen gaze caught sight of something unusual, something small, almost trivial, yet enough to rouse suspicion. Among the gifts and tokens exchanged during the festivities were finely embroidered purses, delicate works of silk and thread, crafted by the hands of noble ladies. It was a custom at court for ladies to bestow such items upon knights as marks of favour, tokens that could be displayed during tournaments or carried in daily life. Isabella, herself versed in the subtleties of courtly exchange, noticed that certain purses, recognized as the handiwork of her sisters-in-law, appeared in the possession of knights who should not have borne them. Gautier and Philippe Darnay, handsome young brothers serving at court, were seen carrying such tokens, their presence near the princesses more familiar than seemed proper. To most eyes, this detail might have passed unnoticed, dismissed as courtesy or coincidence. But Isabella, trained in suspicion by her life with Edward, saw more than idle chance. Her mind, sharp and calculating, turned quickly over the possibilities. Were her sisters-in-law merely careless in their gifts? Or was there truth to the whispers already circulating in the palace? Did Margaret, Blanche, and perhaps even Joan indulge in attachments that dishonoured their marriages? Isabella's position as daughter of Philip IV and Queen of England gave her both proximity and distance. She was close enough to observe, yet removed enough to weigh the consequences with a dispassionate eye, and her motives, though not entirely clear, leaned toward revelation. Perhaps she sought to strengthen her father's authority by exposing weakness within the family. Perhaps she wished to strike at Edward indirectly, proving her value as a loyal daughter and political ally. Or perhaps she simply could not resist the temptation to act upon what she had discovered. From that moment, Isabella began to observe more carefully. She noted glances exchanged across the hall, subtle gestures that might be overlooked by others. She listened when servants murmured gossip in corners, piecing together fragments into a coherent suspicion. She carried her knowledge like a weapon, waiting for the opportune moment to unsheath it. In her silence, she embodied the very lessons her father had instilled: to speak little, to watch much, to act only when certain, and when certainty came, she knew exactly where to turn. To accuse her sisters-in-law outright would have been reckless. Such charges required proof, and in the world of medieval courts, proof meant tokens, witnesses, and confession. But Isabella had gathered enough to warrant her father's attention. Philip IV, though stern and often cold, valued his daughter, and her words carried weight. She revealed her suspicions, the sight of the purses in the hands of the Darnay brothers, the whispers that followed them, the gestures she had observed. To the Iron King, such information was explosive, for it struck not merely at personal honour, but at the very stability of the dynasty. If the wives of his sons betrayed their marriages, then the legitimacy of future heirs was tainted, the succession itself endangered. To Philip, who had spent his reign tightening his grip upon every corner of France, such a scandal was intolerable. Yet even as she spoke, Isabella must have felt the weight of her revelation. To expose her sisters-in-law was to unleash disgrace upon her own family, to tarnish the very crown that shone above them all. Still, her decision was made. Perhaps she calculated that the damage of concealment would outweigh the damage of exposure. Perhaps she acted out of loyalty to her father, seeking his favour. Perhaps, in her heart, she relished the chance to wield power in a court where women were often denied it. Whatever her motives, her words set events in motion that could not be undone. The court of Paris, still glittering with the remnants of its festivities, now carried beneath its silken drapes a storm ready to break. Isabella's revelation did not yet reach the ears of all, but in the private chambers of the king, in the guarded whispers of his advisors, the scandal was already unfolding. The princess, who had grown up beneath the gaze of the Iron King, who had learned to watch in silence and strike with precision, had now set into motion a series of events that would destroy reputations, end lives, and bring a dynasty to its knees. In that moment, the watchful eyes of Isabella had pierced the glittering illusion of harmony, revealing the frailty beneath. The purses, innocent enough in themselves, became the symbols of betrayal, tokens not of courtesy but of sin. And from that detail, from that observation, the edifice of the Capetians would begin to crumble. In the glittering world of the Capetian court, amid the stern faces of jurists and the calculated movements of princes, there appeared two figures who embodied the chivalric ideal: Gautier and Philippe d'Aunay, brothers of noble but not exalted birth, men whose youth, courage, and gallant appearance made them stand out among the crowd of courtiers. They were knights in the service of the royal household, sworn to defend the dignity of the crown, and their loyalty was unquestioned. Yet for all their devotion, they were also young, handsome, and susceptible to the entanglements that arose in the close confines of palace life. Their armor gleamed in the sunlight during tournaments, their voices carried songs of valor, and their manners exuded the charm that came naturally to those who lived in the company of royalty, but were not burdened by the same weight of destiny. It was perhaps inevitable that their presence would draw the attention of the young princesses, whose own lives, wrapped in ceremony and cold marriages, yearned for warmth and admiration. Gautier, the elder, was bold, with broad shoulders and a manner that mixed confidence with recklessness. He excelled in jousts, his lance striking with precision, his horsemanship admired by all who watched. He laughed readily, and in his laughter there was freedom, the kind of freedom the princesses scarcely knew in their rigid lives. Philippe, the younger, was quieter, more thoughtful, with a grace that manifested not in loud gestures, but in subtle attentiveness. Where Gautier dazzled with bravado, Philippe charmed with gentleness, and together they formed a pair whose presence illuminated the otherwise sombre atmosphere of the Capetian court. To the eyes of the nobles, they were useful retainers, valuable in service, ornaments of the tournaments. To the eyes of the princesses, they became something more: figures of fascination, of forbidden allure, of a possibility that life might be different from the cold embraces of their husbands. It began, as such things often do, with small gestures: a glance exchanged across the hall during a feast, a moment of laughter shared in the gardens, a token handed under the guise of courtesy. The palace, filled with hundreds of eyes, offered surprisingly many corners of privacy: alcoves behind pillars, quiet chapels where prayers concealed whispers, galleries where the footfalls of servants masked hurried conversations. The princesses, restless in their marriages, found themselves drawn to the vitality of the d'Aunay brothers. Margaret, spirited and bold, perhaps initiated the first encounters, her fiery nature unwilling to endure neglect without seeking solace. Blanche, gentle and yearning, may have followed, finding in the attentions of a knight the tenderness absent in Charles's suspicion. Joan, cautious and composed, lingered on the edge of such entanglements, careful not to risk her stability, but close enough to be implicated by association. And the knights, caught between duty and desire, allowed themselves to be drawn into a web that would soon ensnare them utterly. These meetings were not the open declarations of romance sung by troubadours, but furtive encounters, arranged with care, wrapped in secrecy. The princesses, their hands skilled in embroidery, crafted purses and small tokens, gifts that could be passed discreetly, carried proudly by their lovers, and noticed only by the most observant eyes. The d'Aunay brothers, emboldened by the favour of royal women, carried themselves with a confidence that drew whispers, for to win the affection of a princess was no small triumph, even if it remained hidden. They became frequent presences near the women's chambers, their service excused by their positions at court, their familiarity tolerated though not unremarked. The more often they appeared, the more tongues wagged, and the more dangerous their situation became. The court, for all its vigilance, was also a place of habit, where patterns became invisible by repetition. Servants accustomed to seeing the d'Aunays near the princesses ceased to question it. Courtiers, eager to avoid trouble, pretended not to notice. Even the princes, distracted by their own concerns, failed at first to see what lay before them. And so the liaisons grew bolder, a whispered conversation at nightfall, a secret tryst arranged in a secluded tower, the rustle of silk against stone, the hush of breath in the stillness of a chamber. Desire, once awakened, is not easily silenced, and in the constrained world of the Capetian princesses, these encounters became lifelines, moments of passion in otherwise suffocating days. But secrecy, in a court such as Philip's, was a fragile veil. Every gift exchanged, every glance observed, became fodder for rumor. Gossip moved like smoke through the halls, curling into every corner, slipping past locked doors. The ladies in waiting, ever close, whispered among themselves. Guards stationed outside chambers spoke of movements at odd hours. Even the clerks who recorded the expenses of the household might have noted the unusual frequency of materials requested for embroidery. The palace was a hive of watchfulness, and though no one yet dared to speak openly, the knowledge began to spread in half-formed sentences, in raised eyebrows, in laughter quickly silenced. It was Isabella of France, visiting from England, who perceived what others chose to ignore. Her sharp eyes, trained by her father's cold example and sharpened further by her difficult life with Edward II, saw the truth in the tokens, in the familiarity, in the careless confidence of the knights. And unlike others, she did not merely gossip, she acted. Her report to her father transformed whispers into suspicion, suspicion into investigation. For Philip IV, to whom the honour of the crown was sacred, such betrayal was unthinkable, intolerable, and deadly. The Darnay brothers, for all their charm and vigour, had unknowingly stepped across a line that could not be uncrossed. In a court ruled by an Iron King, their affair with the princesses was not merely an indiscretion, it was treason, a crime against the very foundation of dynastic legitimacy. For if the wives of the princes strayed, who could say whether the children they bore belonged to their husbands or to others? The question struck at the heart of monarchy itself, and in a world where succession was everything, even the hint of doubt could unleash chaos. The knights, once admired for their gallantry, now stood on the brink of ruin, their fates tied to the whispered meetings that had seemed so intoxicating. And yet, in those final days before discovery, before suspicion hardened into accusation, they still moved through the palace with confidence, still accepted tokens, still lingered in the glow of forbidden affection. Perhaps they believed themselves safe, protected by silence, hidden by the complicity of those who looked away. Perhaps they underestimated the cold resolve of the king, or perhaps they simply could not resist the passion that had taken hold of them, preferring danger to denial, destruction to emptiness. Whatever their thoughts, the meetings continued, the gifts were exchanged, and the whispers grew louder, until at last the storm broke and the court of France was thrown into scandal. The scandal that would shatter the Capetian dynasty, that would stain the royal line of France with shame and suspicion, began with objects so delicate, so seemingly innocent, that few could have imagined their ruinous power. They were purses, finely embroidered by noble hands, crafted of silk and gold thread, adorned with patterns of flowers and heraldic devices. In the quiet hours of the women's chambers, Margaret, Blanche, and perhaps even Joan bent over their work, their fingers guiding needles through rich cloth, each stitch an expression of care, each design a secret gift intended not for the glory of the court but for the intimacy of affection. In the world of courtly love, such tokens carried meaning. They were more than adornments. They were signs of favour, proofs of devotion, symbols that bound knight to lady in bonds both chivalric and amorous. When the princesses placed their purses into the hands of Gautier and Philippe Darnay, the gesture was as dangerous as it was tender, for in that act, concealed in embroidery, lay the evidence of betrayal. At first, the purses passed quietly, unnoticed by most. Knights often carried favours from ladies during tournaments, ribbons, kerchiefs, or tokens worn upon their sleeves as signs of devotion. Yet in this case, the purses were not publicly displayed as declarations of courtly play. They were kept, carried, and used by the brothers in daily life, their provenance obvious to those familiar with the handiwork of the princesses. The embroidery was distinctive, the patterns unmistakable. A lady's hand left its trace as surely as her signature, and those who had seen the princesses at work recognized the stitching. To most, this knowledge remained a curiosity, a whisper shared in confidence. But to one set of eyes, sharp and unyielding, the sight of the purses was proof of a transgression that could not be ignored. Isabella of France, Queen of England, and daughter of Philip IV, had come to Paris for festivities in 1313, and it was during those celebrations that her gaze fell upon the incriminating tokens. She saw the purses in the possession of the Darnay brothers, recognized their origin, and understood at once what they signified. To others, they might have been harmless gifts. To Isabella, trained in the watchfulness of her father's court and embittered by the humiliations of her own marriage, they were symbols of betrayal, evidence that her sisters-in-law had dishonored her brothers and, by extension, the crown itself. Her heart may have hardened as she considered the implications. If these women, daughters of Burgundy and wives of Capetian princes, dared to indulge in such follies, then the very legitimacy of France's heirs could be cast into doubt. The dynasty her father had built so carefully, with iron discipline and endless calculation, stood imperiled by the desires of a few restless hearts. Isabella's motives in bringing her discovery to Philip IV have long been debated. Some say she acted out of loyalty to her father, eager to expose corruption within the family that threatened the majesty of the crown. Others suggest she was driven by bitterness, seeking to distract from her own unhappy life by turning attention to the faults of others. Still others imagine that she was simply unable to keep silence, that the truth, once seen, demanded revelation. Whatever her reasons, she chose to speak, and in so doing, she set the course of destruction. To Philip IV, the purses were not merely tokens of indiscretion, they were daggers aimed at the heart of his dynasty. The king, stern and unbending, responded not with outburst but with silence. He listened to his daughter's account, weighed the evidence, and then began to act with the cold precision that had defined his reign. Quiet inquiries were made, discreet watchers assigned, and soon the whispers of servants, the gossip of courtiers, and the observations of guards coalesced into a picture too damning to ignore. The princesses had indeed compromised themselves. The Darnay brothers, emboldened by affection, had grown careless, and the purses, those fragile works of embroidery, had betrayed them all. For the princesses, the act of crafting those tokens must have carried both thrill and peril. As they bent over their work in the soft light of their chambers, did they imagine the consequences? Did Margaret, fiery and restless, stitch with defiance, eager to bind her knight to her in secret allegiance? Did Blanche, timid and yearning, pour into her embroidery the tenderness she could not give her suspicious husband? Did Joan, cautious and clever, restrain her hand, crafting less boldly, her involvement more muted yet still dangerous by association? In each stitch lay a risk, in each pattern a confession. The purses were silent, yet they spoke louder than words when discovered. When Philip IV at last resolved to act, it was with the ruthlessness that marked his every decision. He did not confront the princesses immediately, nor did he allow the scandal to burst forth uncontrolled. Instead, he prepared a trap, ensuring that when exposure came, it would be undeniable, public, and devastating. For to the Iron King, this was not merely a matter of family honor, but of political survival. If the succession were tainted, if the legitimacy of heirs could be questioned, the very stability of France was endangered. He could not allow such weakness to fester within his dynasty, and so the purses, once symbols of secret affection, became instruments of doom. The court, still unaware of the king's intentions, continued its life of ceremony. Feasts were held, tournaments proclaimed, prayers sung, but beneath the glittering surface, the trap was tightening. The purses had spoken, Isabella had observed, Philip had judged, and the fate of the princesses and their lovers was sealed. Soon, the whispers would give way to accusations, the silken tokens to chains of iron, the laughter of courtly life to cries of anguish, and all because of embroidery, delicate threads that had bound together hearts in secret, but unravelled the destiny of a dynasty when exposed to light. When Isabella's revelation reached the ears of Philip IV, the Iron King did not strike at once. His nature was never impulsive. His power lay in patience, in calculation, in the cold deliberation of a ruler who understood that truth, like prey, must be cornered before it is slain. He listened to his daughter's account with the stillness of a carved statue, his pale face betraying nothing, his eyes fixed as though he looked beyond the chamber walls into the future of his dynasty. The purses, the whispers, the careless familiarity of the Darnay brothers, these were not trifles to him but cracks in the foundation of monarchy. For if the sons of kings could be betrayed, if the chastity of royal wives could be questioned, then the bloodline itself might be poisoned, its legitimacy destroyed. Philip knew well the power of appearances, and he knew too that the honour of his house was the very heart of France. To allow scandal to fester, unpunished, would be to undermine all he had built. And so he set about, quietly, mercilessly, to ensnare the guilty. His first step was silence. No whisper of suspicion was permitted to reach the ears of the accused. The princesses continued their lives within the palace, Margaret laughing at feasts, Blanche attending prayers, Joan conversing with her husband. The Darnay brothers, bold and unguarded, still moved through the corridors, unaware of the net closing around them. Courtiers, servants, and guards saw nothing unusual in the king's demeanour, for Philip revealed nothing. Yet, behind the scenes, he summoned his most trusted advisers, men loyal to the crown above all else, and instructed them to gather evidence. They watched, they listened, they followed the movements of the knights, noting each visit, each lingering glance, each token exchanged. What gossip had once been rumour now became testimony, recorded in silence, ready to be used when the king struck. Philip's patience was a weapon. He understood that to expose the scandal prematurely would be to risk denial, evasion, or even escape. He needed irrefutable proof, the kind that could not be dismissed, the kind that would render even the proudest guilty incapable of protest. Thus, he allowed the liaisons to continue a little longer, permitted the guilty to weave their own nooses, while he waited, watchful, silent. The palace, with its stone walls and narrow staircases, its hidden alcoves and guarded chambers, became a labyrinth of surveillance, every movement of the princesses and their lovers observed by eyes they could not see. At times, one wonders whether the princesses sensed the danger. Did Margaret, bold and fiery, notice the sudden caution in the glances of her attendants? Did Blanche, timid and uncertain, feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her when she left her chambers? Did Joan, cautious and clever, suspect that her sister-in-law's folly had drawn them all into peril? Perhaps they sensed nothing, believing themselves secure within the silence of complicity that had until now shielded them. Or perhaps they sensed much, but desire, once awakened, was stronger than fear, and they chose to ignore the danger for the sake of passion. For in the gilded cage of the Capetian court, even the shadow of ruin might have seemed preferable to the chill of loveless marriages. The Darnay brothers, too, moved with a confidence that betrayed carelessness. Emboldened by affection, they carried themselves as though untouchable, knights favoured by princesses, protected by proximity to the crown. Their arrogance blinded them to the peril of their position. They had crossed the invisible line between courtesy and betrayal, yet they seemed to believe that secrecy, however imperfect, would suffice to shield them. They rode in tournaments, laughed in the company of courtiers, and bore their embroidered purses with pride, as though their victories were not only in the lists but in love. They had forgotten, or perhaps never truly grasped, the iron nature of the king they served. Philip, meanwhile, prepared the moment of revelation with precision. He arranged for the arrests to be sudden, public, and undeniable, so that when the accusations came, they would fall not as rumours but as thunderbolts of truth. He summoned loyal guards, prepared chambers for interrogation, and ensured that the machinery of justice was ready to grind into motion. He allowed Isabella's testimony to be recorded, not as hearsay, but as royal witness, binding the scandal not to idle gossip, but to the very voice of the Queen of England. Every detail was calculated, every step measured, until the trap stood ready to spring. And then, when all was in place, the Iron King gave the signal. The palace that had seemed so calm, so secure, became suddenly a place of terror. Guards moved with purpose, doors were flung open, and the Darnay brothers, caught unawares, were seized. Their protests were silenced, their swords taken, their bodies bound in chains. At the same time, the princesses were confined, their chambers locked, their movements restricted, their jewels and gowns suddenly meaningless against the iron bars of suspicion. The court, once filled with laughter and music, fell into stunned silence, the whispers now louder than trumpets. The scandal, long hidden, had burst into the open, and all of Paris trembled with the knowledge that the royal family itself was tainted by betrayal. Philip IV, silent and immovable, revealed nothing of his thoughts as he watched his plan unfold. His face was as pale and cold as ever, his voice calm as he commanded the proceedings. To him, this was not merely punishment, it was purification. The dynasty must be cleansed, its honor preserved, its legitimacy assured, and if that meant the destruction of his daughters-in-law and the brutal punishment of their lovers, so be it. For the Iron King, family bonds meant little compared to the survival of the crown. Thus the trap, long prepared in silence, was sprung with ruthless efficiency. The guilty, once confident, now stood accused. The innocent, once complicit by silence, now trembled in fear. The court, once radiant in splendor, now lay shadowed by disgrace, and all of France, from the highest noble to the humblest peasant, would soon hear the tale that within the gilded halls of the Capetian palace, beneath silk drapes and embroidered purses, desire had flourished and scandal had been born. The night the scandal erupted into the open was one that Paris would not soon forget. The Seine flowed quietly beneath the stone arches of its bridges, the lamps along the quays flickered, and the towers of the royal palace loomed in their usual majesty. But beneath this familiar stillness, the air was thick with tension. Guards, hand-picked by Philip IV, moved silently through the corridors and courtyards, their boots muffled by cloaks, their orders whispered but firm. For weeks the Iron King had prepared the trap, and now, at last, he was ready to strike. The signal had been given, and the very heart of the Capetian household was about to be torn open. The arrests began with the Darnay brothers. Gautier and Philippe, unsuspecting, moved freely through the palace as they had done countless times before, confident in their service and untroubled by the whispers that had begun to circle. Yet suddenly they found themselves surrounded, swords drawn, chains rattling, torches casting harsh light upon faces twisted with purpose. Resistance was futile. Their arms were seized, their weapons stripped away, their bodies bound. For a moment, they may have cried out in confusion, protesting their innocence, demanding to know the cause of such violence. But the guards, hardened and loyal to the king, offered no explanation. The brothers were dragged through the halls, their boots scraping against stone, their shouts echoing in the vaulted ceilings until they were silenced by the slam of prison doors. Almost simultaneously, the princesses themselves were confined. Margaret, Blanche, and Joan were taken from their chambers, their jewels glinting in the torchlight, their silks trailing as they were hurried away. For them, the suddenness of the arrest must have been a terror beyond imagining. Moments before, they had been princesses of France, wives of the king's sons, women adorned with dignity and wealth. Now they were captives, accused of treachery, their fate hanging not on affection or ceremony, but on the cold judgment of the Iron King. Margaret, fiery in spirit, may have cried out in protest, her voice echoing with outrage. Blanche, timid and fearful, may have wept silently, her pale face ashen. Joan, ever the most cautious, may have attempted to defend herself with reason, though her words would have found no ear willing to listen. The arrests were not about dialogue, they were about demonstration. Paris awoke to the news as if struck by a thunderclap. Word spread quickly, carried by servants, soldiers, and rumour-mongers, until every tavern, every market, every university hall buzzed with the tale. The princesses, wives of the royal princes, accused of adultery. The Darnay brothers, once admired for their gallantry, thrown into prison. The purses, the tokens, the whispers, all confirmed now in the king's merciless action. The people of Paris, ever hungry for scandal, murmured in disbelief. Some gasped at the audacity of the women, daring to betray husbands who were sons of the king. Others whispered that such things were inevitable in a court so cold, where marriages were cages rather than bonds. Some pitied the knights, ensnared by passion. Others condemned them as fools who had invited their own destruction. Whatever the opinion, the scandal was all that anyone spoke of, for nothing could overshadow the disgrace of the royal family. The location most associated with the exposure was the Tour de Nesle, a tower along the Seine that loomed dark and formidable, a place that soon became synonymous with scandal. Though the exact details of the arrests remain blurred by time and rumour, chroniclers placed the events near this site, claiming that the princesses had met their lovers there in secrecy, hidden from the eyes of the court. Whether or not this tower truly bore witness to their liaisons, its name became forever linked with their disgrace, a symbol of sin uncovered, a monument of shame. In the minds of Parisians, the Tour de Nesle was no longer just a fortress, but the stage upon which royal virtue had collapsed. The arrests, however, were only the beginning. Philip IV, stern and deliberate, intended not merely to confine but to expose, to punish, to make an example so severe that none would ever dare such betrayal again. The machinery of justice began to grind forward. Interrogations were prepared, torture chambers readied, judges summoned. The princesses, once seated in gilded halls, now found themselves in cold, bare rooms, stripped of adornments, their futures uncertain. The Downay brothers, once the darlings of tournaments, now awaited questioning in darkness, their bodies shackled, their hearts heavy with dread. The princes themselves, Louis, Philip and Charles, were shaken to the core. For Louis, whose wife Margaret was accused most boldly, the humiliation was unbearable. To be heir to the throne and yet cuckolded by his wife was an insult beyond endurance. His temper flared, his shame visible to all, and though he had never treated Margaret with tenderness, her betrayal still struck at his pride like a blade. Charles, whose wife Blanche had been seized, was consumed by jealousy, his suspicions now confirmed, his bitterness deepened into hatred. Philip the Tall, whose wife Joan was implicated less clearly, remained more composed, yet even he could not escape the taint of scandal, for guilt by association was enough to wound his dignity. The three brothers, heirs of the Capetian line, found themselves bound not only by blood but by shame, their households torn apart, their futures clouded. For Philip IV, the arrests were a grim triumph. He had acted swiftly, decisively, leaving no room for doubt or denial. The guilty had been caught, the family honour defended, the dynasty preserved at least outwardly. Yet even as he watched the scandal unfold, he must have known that the damage was done. The world now knew that within his court, within his own household, sin had flourished. The arrests could punish the guilty, but they could not erase the shame. Paris whispered, Europe listened, and the story of the princesses and their lovers spread like wildfire, staining the reputation of the Capetians in ways no punishment could fully repair. The Tour de Nesle affair, as it came to be known, was no longer a secret whispered behind silk drapes. It was a scandal proclaimed across the kingdom, a tale of desire and betrayal that no amount of ceremony could conceal. And though the Iron King had acted with all the cold precision of his nature, even he could not undo the fact that the dynasty, so carefully built, so ruthlessly preserved, now bore a scar that would never fade. The arrests had torn through the court like a storm, but it was the trial that transformed whispers into an inescapable reality, turning private shame into public spectacle. In the chambers of justice, beneath vaulted ceilings hung with the banners of France, the fate of the Darnay brothers and the princesses was set before the world. To Philip IV, this was not simply a matter of family disgrace. It was a question of the integrity of the monarchy, of the sanctity of succession, of the very legitimacy of the Capetian line. Thus he pursued the trial with a severity that echoed through every stone wall of Paris, as if to remind all who watched that betrayal of the crown was not merely sin but treason. The Darnay brothers were the first to face the merciless hand of royal justice. Stripped of their finery, shackled, and gaunt from confinement, they were brought before judges whose faces bore the gravity of men tasked with defending not just law, but the dignity of a dynasty. Gautier, bold and reckless in life, now struggled to maintain courage in chains. Philippe, more reserved, trembled under the weight of accusation. Their crime was not theft, nor murder, nor conspiracy, it was desire, but desire committed with women whose bodies represented the honor of France itself. For knights to love the wives of princes was to undermine the sacred bloodline, to threaten the future kings who would inherit the realm. Thus, though their offence was personal, it was judged as treason. The trial was not conducted with the fairness of modern courts, but with the brutal logic of the age. Accusations were supported by rumour, by testimony of servants, by observations of courtiers. The purses, those fragile works of embroidery, were presented as evidence, their silken threads now transformed into iron chains. Witnesses swore that they had seen the brothers in suspicious circumstances, lingering near the princesses, entering chambers where they should not have been. Each testimony, whether strong or flimsy, was woven together into a tapestry of guilt, impossible to unpick once it was displayed before the eyes of judges eager to please the king. Yet even this was not enough. In the medieval world, confession was considered the highest proof, and confession was often extracted by force. Thus the brothers were taken to the chambers of torment, where the tools of interrogation lay waiting, the rack, the cords, the flames. There, beneath the echo of their own cries, they were broken. Gautier, once bold, screamed as his body was stretched, his limbs pulled taut until truth, or what passed for truth, spilled from his lips. Philippe, gentler in spirit, succumbed quickly, his voice faltering under the searing touch of pain. They confessed to liaisons with the princesses, to secret meetings, to sins of flesh that they had once treasured but now regretted in agony. Whether every word was truth or the desperate invention of men seeking relief from torment scarcely mattered. The crown had its confessions, and that was enough. The princesses, though spared torture, were not spared humiliation. Confined and questioned, they were compelled to answer accusations that cut deeper than any blade. Margaret, fiery and proud, raged against the charges, her defiance echoing in the stone halls. But her protestations were drowned by the weight of evidence and the confessions of her lovers. Blanche, fragile and fearful, wept and trembled, her denial so timid that it convinced no one. Joan, more cautious, defended herself with reason, insisting upon her innocence, and in time her husband's influence would preserve her from the worst of punishment. But in that moment all three stood beneath the shadow of disgrace, their reputations shattered, their futures condemned. The trial became a spectacle for Paris. Crowds gathered outside the halls, eager for news, hungry for scandal. Chroniclers scribbled details, some true, some exaggerated, spreading the tale across Christendom. The daughters-in-law of the mighty Philip IV, accused of adultery, the knights, once admired, confessing under torture, the king himself presiding in icy silence. It was a story too sensational to be contained, and soon every corner of Europe buzzed with the news. Some whispered of pity, claiming the princesses were victims of loveless marriages and cold neglect. Others condemned them harshly, declaring that no ornament of the crown could excuse such treachery. The Darnay brothers, once symbols of chivalry, became examples of folly, their courage in battle overshadowed by their weakness in love. For the Capetian princes, the trial was a humiliation without measure. Louis, the heir, seethed with fury at Margaret, his pride wounded, his honour mocked. Charles, sullen and suspicious, found in Blanche's disgrace a bitter confirmation of his mistrust. Philip the Tall, more composed, endured with grim dignity, his loyalty to Joan unbroken even as her name was whispered alongside her sisters-in-laws. Each prince suffered, each felt the weight of shame, and each saw his marriage collapse under the burden of scandal. The trial was not only of knights and women, it was of the dynasty itself, and the judgment fell heavily upon them all. Through it all, Philip IV remained the Iron King, his face impassive, his will unbending. He had exposed the guilty, extracted confession, and preserved the dignity of the crown through the spectacle of justice. Yet beneath his marble exterior, one wonders if he felt the sting of betrayal not only as king but as father. To see his sons dishonoured, his daughters-in-law disgraced, his household mocked by the world. This was a wound no execution could entirely heal. Still, he pressed forward, for to show weakness would be to invite ruin. The guilty would be punished, the scandal purged, and the dynasty preserved, even if its honor was forever scarred. Thus the trial of desire reached its grim conclusion. The knights condemned, the princesses disgraced, the court humiliated, the kingdom shaken. It was not merely a trial of men and women, but of the frailties of human passion, set against the iron demands of monarchy. And though the verdicts were pronounced and the sentences prepared, the true consequences were only beginning. For this scandal, born of whispers and purses, would echo far beyond the prison walls, carrying the Capetian dynasty toward its own downfall. The verdict, once spoken, swept through the court like a cold wind. The Darnay brothers, broken by torture and confession, had sealed the fate not only of themselves, but of the women who had loved them. Margaret of Burgundy, Blanche of Burgundy, and Joan of Burgundy, daughters of a powerful ducal house, wives of the sons of the King of France, ornaments of the court, now found their lives stripped of dignity, their silks exchanged for rough cloth, their gilded chambers replaced by cells of stone. The fall was brutal, sudden, and irreversible. In a single season, they had descended from the glitter of Parisian feasts to the shadow of confinement, from queens to be to prisoners, whose very existence was now a scandal whispered across Christendom. Margaret, the eldest among them, and the wife of Louis, heir to the throne, suffered most grievously. Her defiance during questioning, her fiery refusal to bend, had marked her as unrepentant in the eyes of the court. For Louis, who already had little affection for her, the humiliation of her betrayal was unbearable. He demanded her punishment with a vehemence that shocked even those accustomed to his temper. Stripped of her jewels and finery, she was confined in the bleak fortress of Chateau Gaillard, perched upon a cliff above the Seine. Once a castle of grandeur, built by Richard the Lionheart, it had become by this time a prison, its damp chambers filled with shadows, its windows narrow slits through which little light entered. There, Margaret was left in isolation, her days consumed by silence, her only companions the guards who watched her without sympathy. The princess, who had once sparkled in tournaments and feasts, now languished in a cold, unforgiving cell, her fate uncertain, her shame complete. Blanche, younger and more fragile, was likewise condemned. Her husband, Charles, whose jealousy and suspicion had always weighed heavily upon their marriage, now saw his darkest fears confirmed. He had never trusted her, never offered her warmth, and now, with the scandal laid bare, he abandoned her entirely. She too was sent to imprisonment, though her confinement was somewhat less harsh than Margaret's. Even so, her life was shattered, her reputation destroyed, her marriage ruined. The gentle girl who had once walked timidly through the halls of the Capetian court now faced her days in despair, her future no longer that of a princess, but of a fallen woman. Joan, wife of Philip the Tall, fared better than her sisters-in-law, though her name had been tarnished by association. She had been implicated in the scandal through rumour, accused of knowledge if not participation, but her husband, unlike his brothers, stood by her. Philip, cautious and deliberate, defended Joan, insisting on her innocence, and his loyalty saved her from the full force of punishment. Though her reputation suffered, she remained at court, her dignity bruised but not destroyed. In time, when her husband ascended the throne, she would become queen, her resilience a testament to her cautious wisdom. Yet even she could not escape the shadow of the affair entirely. Wherever she went, whispers followed, for scandal clings more tightly than truth, and her name was forever linked to the disgrace of her kin. The punishments of the princesses were not hidden in silence. The court made certain that all of France knew of their disgrace. It was a lesson, a warning, a demonstration of the king's iron resolve. Noble women throughout the kingdom whispered in fear, aware that their own lives, too, were bound by the same rigid codes of chastity and obedience. Men spoke of the shame of the Burgundian house, of the dishonour brought upon the Capetians, of the frailty of women who could not resist temptation. Chroniclers recorded the story with relish, some condemning the princesses as wanton, others pitying them as victims of cold marriages and loveless lives. Whatever the opinion, the fact remained. The women who had once adorned the Capetian court were now outcasts, their splendor turned to ruin. For Margaret, the descent ended in tragedy. Confined in the cold chambers of Chateau Gaillard, cut off from companionship, she withered. Some accounts claim she was strangled by order of her husband Louis, who could not bear the shame of having a dishonored wife upon the throne when he became king. Others say she simply died of neglect, her body wasting in the damp and darkness. Whatever the truth, her end was grim, a fitting conclusion to the fall that had begun with the gift of an embroidered purse. From princess to prisoner to corpse, her life was a cautionary tale of passion punished by iron law. Blanche's fate, though less brutal, was no less tragic. She remained in confinement until her marriage was annulled, her status as princess erased, her future uncertain. She faded from the stage of history, her name remembered only in connection with scandal, her gentle presence lost in the shadows of disgrace. The girl who had once longed for affection found only abandonment, her life a casualty of the dynasty's relentless demand for honor. Joan alone endured, her resilience carrying her through the storm. Protected by her husband's loyalty, she restored her dignity in time, but the scars of suspicion never entirely healed. Her survival was not the triumph of love but of calculation, a reminder that in the Capetian court, prudence was as necessary as virtue, and silence as powerful as beauty. Thus the fall of the princesses was complete. From the heights of splendor they had been cast into the depths of shame, their lives forever altered, their names forever stained. The Capetian dynasty, though preserved by the Iron King's ruthless action, bore the mark of their disgrace, a scar that no punishment could erase. Paris whispered, Europe judged, and history remembered. The glittering women who had once walked proudly through the halls of the palace now lingered in memory as symbols of betrayal and ruin. Their downfall, as dramatic as their rise, had been glorious. And yet, even as their lives were shattered, the world looked to the next act, to the fate of the Darnay brothers, whose punishment would be harsher still. For if the princesses had fallen, their lovers would be destroyed, their deaths a spectacle designed to cleanse the dynasty in fire and blood. The fate of the Darnay brothers was sealed from the moment their chains clinked shut behind them. Once admired for their gallantry, praised in tournaments, and welcomed into the gilded halls of the palace, they were now condemned as traitors not merely to their princes, but to the very principle of monarchy itself. In the eyes of Philip IV and his court, they had polluted the sanctity of the royal bloodline, risked casting doubt on the legitimacy of heirs, and in so doing committed a crime that reached beyond personal sin into the realm of treason. Their punishment, therefore, would not be hidden in shadow. It would be public, brutal, and unforgettable, a grim spectacle designed to terrify, to cleanse, and to remind all of France that the crown could not be mocked without consequence. The execution was prepared in Paris, with a deliberateness that reflected the Iron King's sense of order. A scaffold was raised in a place where crowds could gather, where citizens, nobles, and clerics alike could witness the destruction of the guilty. Word spread swiftly through the city, and on the appointed day, throngs filled the streets, pressing against each other, murmuring with anticipation, their breath clouding in the chill air. Paris, so often filled with music and trade, now hummed with morbid curiosity. For these were not common criminals to be hanged quietly at dawn. These were knights of the royal household, lovers of princesses, men whose downfall revealed the corruption of the highest circle of power. Their death was theatre as much as punishment, and all the world was eager to see it. The brothers were brought forth, their bodies weakened by weeks of confinement and torture. Chains rattled around their wrists and ankles, their faces pale and drawn, their once proud bearing broken but not entirely extinguished. Gautier, the elder, still carried a trace of defiance in his eyes, as though unwilling to surrender fully to shame. Philippe, younger and gentler, appeared more crushed, his steps faltering, his expression haunted by dread. Both wore rough garments, the finery of knights replaced by rags that marked them as condemned. They were paraded through the streets, jeered at by some, pitied by others, their names shouted by the crowd as though they were characters in a morality play. Their sentence was one of the most horrific reserved for traitors, a deliberate degradation of the body that symbolized the gravity of their crime. Chroniclers record that they were flayed, their flesh torn by knives, their cries echoing in the air. Their manhood, the instrument of their betrayal, was mutilated, cast into the fire before their eyes. Then, with the crowd pressed close, they were broken upon the wheel, their limbs shattered one by one with iron clubs, their bones splintering beneath the force. At last, their bodies were decapitated, their heads displayed as warnings, their remains consigned to the flames. It was a death designed to strip them of dignity, to erase them from memory, to mark them not as knights but as traitors whose names deserved only contempt. And yet, in that horror, something of their humanity lingered. Some in the crowd wept at the sight, unable to reconcile the brutality with the men they had once admired. Others turned away, muttering that such cruelty was excessive, that love, however misplaced, should not have earned such torment. Still others cheered, declaring that justice had been done, that the honor of the crown had been cleansed in blood. Whatever their reaction, none who stood in Paris that day forgot what they had seen. The execution etched itself into memory, a scar upon the conscience of France, a reminder of the ferocity of royal justice under the Iron King. For Philip IV, the deaths of the Daunay brothers were a necessity, not an indulgence. He had ruled with iron for decades, crushing rebellion, humbling the Pope, destroying the Templars, and in each case, he had relied on spectacle as much as force. To leave the brothers alive, even in chains, would be to invite whispers of leniency, to allow the scandal to fester. By destroying them utterly, he sent a message that no one, knight, noble, or princess could dishonor the monarchy without paying the ultimate price. It was justice as the king understood it, cold, merciless, absolute. For the princesses, the execution was a moment of terrible reckoning. Margaret, confined in her fortress cell, may have heard news of her lover's death and wept, her pride shattered, her heart broken. Blanche, imprisoned in sorrow, must have felt her own guilt sharpened by the knowledge that the man who had offered her tenderness had been destroyed because of her. Joan, cautious and calculating, perhaps thanked God that she had escaped deeper involvement, her survival preserved by her husband's loyalty. Yet even she could not escape the shadow of the scaffold. For them, the deaths of the Darnay brothers were both punishment and farewell, the end of their secret passions and the beginning of their long years of disgrace. And for the princes, the sons of Philip IV, the execution was humiliation transfigured into rage. Louis, soon to be king, seethed with fury not only at Margaret but at the knights who had mocked his honor. Charles, brooding and bitter, found in Blanche's disgrace a wound that deepened his suspicion of all around him. Philip the Tall, though more measured, could not wholly escape the stain, his wife's reputation forever clouded by the scandal. The deaths of the Daunay brothers may have silenced the immediate threat, but they could not heal the injury to pride, nor erase the memory of betrayal. Thus ended the lives of Gautier and Philippe Darnay, once knights of promise, destroyed by desire and crushed by the iron hand of justice. Their deaths did not restore the Capetian dynasty's purity. Instead, they etched its corruption into the annals of history, ensuring that the scandal would never be forgotten. The Tour de Nesle affair was no longer a whisper of tokens and glances. It was a story written in blood upon the stones of Paris, a tale of love turned to ruin, of passion punished with horror. Yet even as the smoke of their execution drifted into the sky, the consequences of the scandal were not finished. The dynasty itself had been weakened, its unity shattered, its future uncertain, for in the years to come, each of Philip IV's sons would take the throne, and each would find his reign brief, troubled, and haunted by the memory of the scandal that had destroyed their wives and their honor. Some said it was justice, others said it was the curse of the Templars, but all agreed that the downfall of the Darnay brothers was not the end, but only a grim turning point in the decline of the Capetian line. The scaffold was emptied, the cries of the Darnay brothers still echoing in the memory of Paris, when Philip IV turned his attention once more to the matter of his own household. For the Iron King, justice was never finished until it was thorough, and mercy was rarely permitted to soften the edge of law. He had crushed the Templars not only by execution but by the eradication of their very name. He had humbled the papacy, not with compromise but with domination. And now, within his own family, he sought no less. The disgrace of his daughters-in-law, the humiliation of his sons, the stain upon the dynasty, all these demanded not only punishment, but the cold assertion of control. His heart, if it ached at all, was hidden behind the marble mask of kingship. To Philip IV, fatherhood mattered less than kingship, and blood ties less than the inviolability of the crown. He considered each of the women as if they were matters of state rather than flesh and blood. Margaret, wife of Louis, and once destined to be Queen of France, was imprisoned in Chateau Gaillard, her fiery protests silenced by stone walls. To spare her would have meant parading a dishonoured queen beside the throne when Louis ascended, a prospect unthinkable for the dynasty. Philip, cold and precise, allowed her to waste away in confinement, whether by neglect or by subtle order, until her death removed the problem entirely. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was calculation, the excision of a diseased limb to preserve the body. Margaret's fall was both punishment and necessity in the eyes of the king, a sacrifice offered to protect the crown. Blanche, the delicate wife of Charles, fared little better. Her betrayal had cut deeply into her husband's jealous heart, and Philip saw no reason to intervene on her behalf. She, too, was imprisoned, stripped of dignity, and abandoned to the will of her husband's bitterness. Whether she languished in sorrow or prayed in repentance mattered little to the king. What mattered was that she was removed from the stage, her presence no longer a threat to the dynasty's fragile honour. Her marriage, like Margaret's, collapsed into ashes, annulled as though it had never been. She ceased to be a princess and became instead a ghost of scandal, her name whispered with pity or scorn, but never again with respect. Joan, wife of Philip the Tall, stood as the lone exception. Her case was less clear, her guilt less proven, and her husband's loyalty more steadfast. Philip IV, though stern, was not blind to the value of pragmatism. To destroy Joan entirely would have been to weaken Philip the Tall, the son most capable of preserving the dynasty's dignity. Thus the king allowed her to remain, tarnished but intact, her position salvaged by her husband's defence. It was not affection that spared her, it was utility. For Philip IV, decisions of family were weighed upon the scales of politics, and Joan's survival was simply a matter of balance. The princes themselves received no comfort from their father. Louis, humiliated by Margaret's betrayal, burned with fury, yet his father offered no sympathy. To Philip IV, Louis's shame was his own burden to bear, a reminder that kingship was not an ornament but a trial. Charles, bitter and insecure, likewise found no solace. His father neither consoled nor condemned him, treating his anguish with the same cold silence that had defined their entire relationship. Only Philip the Tall, whose composure mirrored his father's, received a measure of trust, though even here the Iron King's approval was more pragmatic than paternal. In the eyes of Philip IV, sons and daughters alike were instruments of the crown, and their worth was measured not in their happiness, but in their utility to the dynasty. The people of Paris marvelled at the king's severity. Some praised his iron judgment, declaring that he had placed the crown above all, even above family, proving that no one was beyond the reach of royal justice. Others muttered in fear, whispering that a man who could treat his own children with such coldness was less a father than a machine, more statue than flesh. Chroniclers recorded the tale with awe, describing how the king had struck down scandal in his own house with the same ruthless hand that had humbled the Pope and destroyed the Templars. To them, Philip was a figure of terrifying majesty, a monarch who embodied law itself, who sacrificed even his own blood to preserve the purity of the state. And yet, beneath the grandeur of his judgment, the seeds of weakness were sown. By crushing the scandal with such severity, Philip IV may have preserved appearances, but he could not heal the wounds within his family. His sons, already distant, became further estranged, bound not by affection but by fear. His daughters-in-law, destroyed or disgraced, left the dynasty weakened, their alliances broken, their marriages hollowed. The court, though outwardly restored to order, buzzed still with whispers, for no punishment could erase memory, and no execution could silence gossip. The Tour de Nesle affair lingered like a shadow, an unspoken reminder of the frailty of even the greatest monarchy. Philip IV himself seemed unmoved, his face carved in marble, his actions precise as ever, but those who looked closely might have seen the toll upon him. Within a year of the scandal's eruption, the Iron King would be dead. Some said from a hunting accident, others whispered from the weight of divine judgment. Chroniclers remembered the curse of Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Templars, who from the flames had summoned Philip and his heirs before the tribunal of God. And as one by one his sons would ascend the throne only to die young, many would remember this moment, the king's iron judgment against his own household, as proof that the curse had been fulfilled. For now, however, in the final years of his reign, Philip IV had acted as he always had, coldly, decisively, without mercy. He had torn scandal from his dynasty as one tears rot from a tree, leaving scars where once there had been branches of promise. He had shown the world that even his own family could not defy the majesty of the crown, and in so doing, he had preserved the image of monarchy, an image that would soon crumble, but for the moment still gleamed with the cold brilliance of iron. When the storm of arrests and executions had subsided, when the cries of the Daunay brothers had faded into silence, and the whispers of Paris had begun to settle into weary repetition, what remained was not triumph nor peace, but silence, a silence that crept into the very marriages of the Capetian princes. In this silence lay the ashes of intimacy, the ruin of trust, and the brittle remnants of unions that had been designed for dynastic strength, but which had collapsed beneath the weight of betrayal. The scandal had been purged with fire and iron, yet the scars it left behind could not be erased. For Louis, Philip, and Charles, their marriages were no longer bonds but chains, and their private lives, once hidden beneath the splendor of ceremony, became barren landscapes of resentment, suspicion, and cold endurance. Louis, eldest son of Philip IV and heir to the throne, bore the heaviest burden. His wife, Margaret, had been condemned for adultery and confined to Chateau Gaillard, where she wasted away in isolation. Louis had never been a gentle husband. His temper was sharp, his passions quick, his care for Margaret minimal. Yet her betrayal struck him not as loss of love, but as a wound to pride, a humiliation that gnawed at his honor as prince and future king. To walk through the palace as heir, while all whispered of his cuckoldry, was torment enough. To imagine her as queen beside him was unthinkable. Thus, Louis allowed, and perhaps even demanded, her destruction. When she died in confinement, whether by neglect, by cold design, or, as some whispered, by a rope tightened around her throat, Louis was freed of her, but not of the stain she left behind. His marriage had collapsed into disgrace, and with it, the promise of a harmonious reign was poisoned before it began. Charles, the youngest, lived in the shadow of his wife Blanche's disgrace. His nature had always been suspicious, prone to jealousy, and now those suspicions had been confirmed in the harshest way possible. Blanche's imprisonment, her annulled marriage, her fall into oblivion, all were, to Charles, not merely justice but vindication of his darkest fears. Yet vindication did not bring him peace. Instead, it deepened his bitterness, his distrust of women, his sense of injury against the world. His marriage had not only collapsed, it had left him incapable of believing in love or loyalty again. For Charles, whose temper was sullen and whose heart was restless, the collapse of his union became the defining bitterness of his life. Even when he remarried, even when new alliances were formed, the shadow of Blanche's betrayal lingered, making his heart a fortress no affection could penetrate. Philip the Tall, the second son, stood apart in some measure. His wife Joan had been implicated in the scandal by association, her name whispered alongside Margaret's and Blanche's, yet Philip, deliberate and calculating, had chosen to defend her. Whether out of genuine affection, political prudence, or simple recognition of her innocence, he stood by her side. This choice preserved their marriage and, in time, her crown, for when Philip ascended the throne, Joan became queen. Yet even here, the collapse was not entirely averted. Their union, though intact, bore scars. Whispers never fully ceased. Every smile, every gesture of Joan's was weighed by those who remembered, and every glance Philip cast upon her carried the tension of memory. Their marriage endured, but it endured in silence, marked less by warmth than by mutual calculation, less by intimacy than by necessity. The collapse of these marriages was more than personal tragedy. It was dynastic weakness. The Capetian princes were supposed to embody stability, the seamless continuity of rule. Their wives were supposed to embody virtue, the sanctity of the dynasty's future. Yet, after the Tour de Nesle affair, their households were in ruins. The heirs to the throne stood disgraced, their marriages broken, their reputations scarred. The people of France, who once gazed upon the royal family with reverence, now whispered of scandal, doubted the purity of succession, and mocked the princes behind their backs. The crown had survived the scandal, but the dynasty's image had been tarnished beyond repair. And yet, the silence endured. In the halls of the palace, where once laughter had echoed during feasts, now there was restraint. The princesses were gone, one dead, one imprisoned and annulled, one subdued into caution. The Daunay brothers had been destroyed. The princes themselves carried on, wearing masks of dignity, but beneath those masks lay emptiness. Louis, hot-blooded and restless, found his pleasures elsewhere, never again seeking loyalty in marriage. Charles, embittered, grew colder, more mistrustful. Philip, deliberate, poured himself into governance, his marriage surviving only because both he and Joan understood the necessity of appearances. None of them found solace in love, none of them restored trust, and none of them healed the wounds left by the scandal. This collapse of their private lives would echo in their reigns. Louis, when he became king, ruled with impatience, his pride still bruised. Charles, when his turn came, ruled with suspicion, his heart closed. Philip, though more capable, ruled with caution, his eyes always watchful for betrayal. The dynasty had lost not only wives but harmony, not only marriages but stability. The silence of their collapsed unions whispered through every council chamber, every procession, every royal decree. For behind the majesty of crowns and the splendor of ceremonies lay broken bonds, and broken bonds make fragile kings. Thus, the scandal of the Tour de Nesle affair did not end with executions and prisons. It lived on in the hollow marriages of the princes, in the distrust that colored their hearts, in the silence that lingered where love should have been. It was a collapse not loud but devastating, not swift but enduring, a collapse that weakened the dynasty more than any battle, more than any rebellion. For kings can rule armies, command laws, and levy taxes, but when their private lives lie in ruins, their crowns rest upon unsteady foundations. And so the Capetian princes carried their broken marriages like unseen chains, chains that would drag them down, one by one, until the dynasty itself crumbled into history. Even as the embers of the Tour de Nesle affair smouldered in the memory of Paris, a darker shadow stretched across the Capetian court, one that tied the scandal not merely to human frailty but to divine retribution. Many whispered of the day in 1314 when Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood chained to a stake upon the Ile de la Cité. The air had been filled with smoke as the flames rose about him, his body writhing in the agony of fire, his voice lifted above the roar of the crowd. He had been condemned as a heretic, accused of crimes that Philip IV had used as justification to destroy the Templar order and seize its wealth. But as the flames consumed him, de Molay had cried out with a curse, summoning the King of France, Pope Clement V, and all who had wronged the order before the judgment of God within a year. To many who stood witness, the words seemed like a final act of defiance, a dying man's cry hurled at power. Yet when events unfolded, when death began to claim those named in his curse, belief in its truth spread like wildfire. Pope Clement V, who had sanctioned the Templars' destruction, was the first to die, struck down by illness not long after the execution. Philip IV followed swiftly, falling from his horse during a hunt in Fontainebleau in November 1314. Though some called it an accident, others claimed divine judgment had taken him. His death within months of de Molay's prophecy, proof that the curse had fallen. And then, in the years that followed, his sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, each wore the crown, only to die young, their reigns short, their dynasty weakened. To the people of France, who had watched the Tour de Nesle scandal unfold, the connection seemed obvious. The destruction of the Templars, the corruption of the royal household, the collapse of marriages, and the premature deaths of kings were all bound together by the curse uttered in flames. The scandal of the princesses was remembered in this context, not merely as human folly, but as part of divine punishment. Chroniclers wrote that the shame brought upon the Capetians was the direct consequence of Philip IV's injustice against the Templars. In their telling, the disgrace of Margaret, Blanche and Joan was no accident, but a judgment upon a dynasty that had dared to spill innocent blood and seize holy treasure. The deaths of the Darnay brothers, gruesome as they were, seemed almost pale beside the greater ruin that followed the ruin of the Capetian line itself. For what was the shame of adulterous princesses compared to the extinction of a royal house that had reigned for centuries? The people, always eager to find meaning in calamity, repeated the tale of the curse with fervour. They whispered it in taverns, taught it to their children, and carried it into the countryside. The fall of the Capetians was not simply politics, not merely the frailty of men, but the hand of God, raised in justice against a king who had defied the sacred. The Tour de Nesle affair, in this light, became not only scandal but symbol, the proof that even the greatest dynasty could not escape judgment, that sin, whether against man or heaven, would find its reckoning. Louis X, the eldest, reigned scarcely 2 years after his father's death. His marriage destroyed, his honour wounded, he ruled with impatience, and in 1316 he was dead, perhaps from illness, perhaps from the weariness of shame. His young widow, Clémence of Hungary, bore him a son, but the infant lived only days, extinguishing Louis's line almost as soon as it began. The curse had claimed the first heir. Philip the Tall followed, his reign longer but still brief. He sought to restore order, to stabilize the realm, and in his wife Joan he found loyalty that had survived the scandal. Yet even he could not escape the shadow of ruin. He died in 1322, leaving no male heir. Another branch of the dynasty cut down. Charles IV, the youngest, came last. His reign too was troubled, his marriages marred by misfortune, his suspicions deepened by the memory of Blanche's betrayal. He ruled only 6 years, dying in 1328. His line ended, his daughters unable to inherit under the law that had been shaped by the very scandal that destroyed their mothers. With him, the direct male line of the Capetians was extinguished, and France was thrown into the uncertainty that would soon blossom into the 100 Years' War. To those who looked back, the pattern was unmistakable. Philip IV had struck down the Templars, had ruled with iron, had punished his daughters-in-law with merciless justice, and yet, for all his power, his dynasty had crumbled within a generation, his sons dying young, his line extinguished. The curse of Jacques de Molay had been fulfilled. The Tour de Nesle affair, far from being an isolated scandal, was part of the greater story of divine justice, the downfall of a family that had risen too high, ruled too coldly, and sinned too greatly. The memory of that curse clung to the story for centuries. Poets repeated it, chroniclers embellished it, storytellers wove it into their tales. The shame of the princesses, the torment of the knights, the collapse of the dynasty, all became part of the legend of the cursed kings of France. And in the minds of the people, the truth was clear. The iron hand of Philip IV had been strong enough to destroy men, but not strong enough to escape the hand of God. When Philip IV, the Iron King, fell from his horse in the autumn of 1314 and died soon thereafter, the dynasty that had seemed so mighty stood suddenly exposed to fragility. For decades he had ruled with the cold authority of law embodied in flesh, and beneath his stern watch the Capetian line had appeared unshakable. Yet his death revealed the truth. His sons, heirs to the greatest throne in Europe, were men weakened by scandal, scarred by humiliation, and incapable of carrying the weight of a kingdom for long. Each in turn would wear the crown, and each in turn would die swiftly, leaving no enduring legacy. The brevity of their reigns was remembered by chroniclers not as mere chance, but as the unfolding of divine judgment, the fulfillment of Jacques de Molay's curse, and the inevitable consequence of a dynasty whose private disgrace had poisoned its public authority. Louis X, known to history as Le Hutin, the quarreller, was the first. He had been heir apparent for years, his temper notorious, his impulses quick, his sense of honour inflamed by the scandal of his wife Margaret. When Philip IV died, Louis took the crown, but he did so with the stain of cuckoldry still clinging to him. His wife, disgraced and imprisoned, had perished in Chateau Gaillard only months before his accession, her death freeing him to remarry. The people whispered of her end. Some said she had been strangled, others that she had wasted away in neglect. But whatever the truth, Louis appeared at his coronation with a new queen, Clémence of Hungary, whose youth and dignity offered a fresh beginning. Yet Louis was restless. He inherited his father's power but not his restraint, and his reign quickly revealed his flaws. His temper brought him into conflict with nobles, his impatience unsettled his court, and his reckless decisions weakened the realm. He sought glory in war but found only frustration. His efforts to govern were undermined by his own impetuous character. And then, scarcely 2 years into his reign, he died suddenly in 1316, at the age of 27. Some claimed it was pneumonia, contracted after an exhausting game of jeu de paume, an early form of tennis. Others whispered of poison. Whatever the cause, his death was swift, leaving his kingdom in turmoil. His queen, Clémence, was pregnant, and all France held its breath. A son might secure the dynasty, a daughter would leave it in peril. In June 1316, a boy was born, Jean I, the posthumous child of Louis and Clémence. Bells rang, prayers rose, Paris rejoiced. Yet the joy lasted only days. The infant died after 5 days of life, extinguishing Louis's line almost as soon as it began. Chroniclers marveled at the cruelty of fate. A king dead at 27, his heir dead before his first week was done. For many, this was the curse manifest, the judgment of God visible to all. The Capetian line, once thought eternal, now trembled on the edge of extinction. It was Philip the Tall, the second son of Philip IV, who next ascended the throne. More deliberate than Louis, more cautious, more resembling his father in temperament, Philip V seemed better suited to kingship. He defended his wife Joan against accusations in the scandal, and she, now crowned queen, shared his dignity. His reign, though brief, was marked by earnest attempts to restore order. He strengthened administration, addressed grievances of the barons, and sought to rebuild trust in the monarchy's stability. Yet the shadow of the scandal lingered. Every decree he issued, every council he held, bore the memory of the disgrace that had tainted the dynasty. He too faced dynastic difficulty, for though he had daughters, he produced no surviving sons. When he died in 1322, after only 6 years on the throne, his line too was extinguished. Another branch of the Capetians ended. Another piece of the curse fulfilled. Charles IV, the youngest son, followed. His marriage to Blanche had been destroyed by scandal, and though he remarried, his life was marked by bitterness and suspicion. He had always been overshadowed by his brothers, and when the crown finally rested upon his head, it did so upon a man already scarred by insecurity. He ruled for 6 years, but his reign was troubled, his temperament sour, his policies inconsistent. Like his brothers, he fathered only daughters, and in 1328 he too was dead, leaving no male heir. With his passing, the direct male line of the Capetians ended a dynasty that had ruled France for over 3 centuries, brought down not by foreign invaders or great wars, but by scandal, infertility, and the inexorable hand of fate. To contemporaries, the meaning was clear. The curse of Jacques de Molay had been fulfilled. The Iron King had destroyed the Templars, and God had destroyed his line. The scandal of the Tour de Nesle affair had weakened the dynasty, undermined its legitimacy, and set the stage for extinction. The succession crisis that followed Charles's death plunged France into uncertainty, opening the door to rival claims, disputes of inheritance, and eventually the long agony of the 100 Years' War. The short reigns of Philip IV's sons were not merely personal tragedies. They were the collapse of a dynasty, the unravelling of a legacy, the beginning of a century of conflict. Thus, the proud Capetians, who had once seemed eternal, fell swiftly. Louis, the quarreller, dead in 2 years. Philip the Tall, dead in 6. Charles, bitter and broken, dead in 6 more. None left sons, none secured the line. The crown that had rested so firmly upon the Iron King now trembled, uncertain, unstable, and doomed to be contested. The scandal of their wives, the disgrace of their marriages, the humiliation of their household, all had been more than private shame. They had been omens, warnings of a dynasty collapsing in upon itself. And so the Tour de Nesle affair echoed beyond the lives of the guilty, shaping the fate of France itself. In the silence that followed Charles IV's death, Europe looked to France and saw not strength but fragility. A dynasty had ended, a curse had been fulfilled, and all because, years before, within the silk-draped chambers of the Capetian court, desire had broken through the iron bars of duty, and scandal had been born. When Charles IV, the youngest son of Philip the Fair, breathed his last in 1328, the long and proud line of direct Capetian kings that had reigned for over 3 centuries came to a silent, irrevocable close. The dynasty that had seemed unshakable under the Iron King was now extinguished in the male line, undone not by battlefield defeat nor foreign invasion, but by the weakness of its heirs and the shadow of scandal that had poisoned the very heart of its continuity. The Capetian tree, whose branches had stretched gloriously across France and into the courts of Europe, suddenly stood bare, its trunk cut at the root. The extinction was not simply a matter of blood, it was a wound to the very identity of France, a rupture that would shake Christendom and open the way to decades of strife. The crisis of succession loomed immediately. Charles IV had left no surviving sons, only daughters, and under the law that had taken shape during his brother Philip the Tall's reign, women could not inherit the throne. That principle, later known as the Salic law, was invoked to exclude his daughters, preserving the idea that the crown of France must always pass through male hands, but if not through Charles's daughters, then through whom? The choice narrowed to 2 rival claims, each with profound consequences. On one side stood Philip of Valois, nephew of Philip IV, descended through the male line. His claim was strong by the letter of the Salic principle, for though more distant in blood, he carried the unbroken line of male succession. On the other side stood Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV, through his daughter Isabella, the very Isabella whose sharp eyes had once exposed the scandal of the Tour de Nesle. Edward, as male heir through a female line, challenged the exclusion of women and their descendants, insisting that his right as grandson outweighed Philip of Valois's status as nephew. The question was simple in form, yet its implications were enormous. Would the crown of France pass to a native prince of the House of Valois, or to the King of England, uniting 2 crowns in a single head? The decision fell to the peers of France, who gathered in council to weigh the claims. They chose Philip of Valois, who was crowned Philip VI in Reims, inaugurating the Valois dynasty. Their reasoning rested upon the rejection of inheritance through the female line, a principle born not only of legal tradition but of fear of foreign domination, fear of instability, fear of repeating the chaos that had followed the scandal of adulterous princesses whose very chastity had been doubted. The stain of the Tour de Nesle affair still lingered, for it had taught France the danger of uncertain lineage, of heirs whose legitimacy could be questioned. The crown, they decided, must remain above such doubts, and thus women and their offspring were excluded. Yet Edward III of England did not accept this rejection quietly. His claim simmered in the background, and in time it ignited into open conflict. In 1337, less than a decade after the end of the direct Capetians, Edward declared himself King of France, challenging Philip VI's authority and plunging Europe into the 100 Years' War. Thus the fall of the Capetian line, the extinction of Philip IV's sons, and the scandal that had tainted their legitimacy all fed into the great conflict that would dominate the 14th and 15th centuries, shaping the destiny of France and England alike. The laughter of minstrels, the whispers behind silk drapes, the embroidered purses, these private indulgences had become, through the iron logic of history, sparks that helped ignite a century of war. For the people of France, the end of the Capetians was a moment of sorrow and unease. The dynasty had seemed eternal, its kings sanctified by the rites of Reims, its bloodline consecrated by centuries of coronations. To lose it was to lose a sense of continuity, to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. Chroniclers recorded the end with a mixture of awe and lament, describing how the mightiest house in Europe had collapsed in a mere generation, undone by fate, scandal, and the will of God. Some blamed Philip IV for his ruthlessness, claiming that his destruction of the Templars had cursed his descendants. Others blamed the weakness of his sons, unfit to bear the burden of kingship. Still others saw in the fall the justice of heaven, punishing a dynasty that had placed pride above piety, iron above mercy. The princesses themselves, though long confined or dead, were remembered as symbols of this collapse. Margaret, fiery and defiant, had perished in prison, her ghost haunting the dynasty that had cast her aside. Blanche, timid and fragile, had faded into obscurity, her disgrace marking Charles's reign with bitterness. Joan alone had endured, becoming queen beside Philip the Tall, yet even her memory was tinged with suspicion. Their scandal, the affair at the Tour de Nesle, became more than a tale of adultery. It became the emblem of a dynasty's decline, the moment when private sin became public ruin. Thus ended the Capetian line, not with a great battle or a glorious death, but with the quiet passing of Charles IV and the disputes of succession that followed. The Iron King's iron hand could not preserve his sons, nor could it secure his lineage. His dynasty, built on law and force, crumbled into silence, leaving behind not the harmony of order but the chaos of war. The end of the Capetians was the end of an era, a turning point in European history, and at its heart lay a scandal born of whispered meetings, forbidden tokens, and the frailty of human hearts. Long after the towers of the Capetians had fallen silent, long after the Iron King and his sons lay buried in the Basilica of Saint-Denis beneath their cold stone effigies, the story of the Tour de Nesle affair endured. It clung to memory not as a simple tale of adultery, but as a legend woven into the fabric of France, an echo that sounded in marble, parchment, and whispered lore. The scandal that had once shaken Paris in its immediacy became, with the passing of years, a parable repeated by chroniclers, a cautionary tale murmured by mothers to their daughters, a piece of history transformed into myth. The courtly purses, the secret trysts, the public executions, these details did not fade. Instead, they sharpened in the telling, embellished, embroidered like the very tokens that had sparked the ruin. Chroniclers of the 14th century, writing in monastic scriptoria or in royal chancelleries, seized upon the scandal as both entertainment and warning. To them, it was proof of the frailty of women, or so they claimed, repeating in moralizing tones the dangers of passion unchecked by virtue. They painted Margaret and Blanche as reckless, their desires undermining dynastic order, their betrayals the spark that helped undo the Capetian line. Joan, spared by her husband's loyalty, appeared as an example of prudence, a woman saved not by innocence alone, but by the careful maintenance of dignity. The Darnay brothers were remembered as gallants turned traitors, knights destroyed by their own weakness. Yet beneath the condemnation ran a current of fascination, for even the sternest chronicler could not disguise the drama of the tale. Princesses and lovers, betrayal and execution, scandal at the very heart of the throne. In the centuries that followed, the story spread beyond chronicles into the imagination of the people. The Tour de Nesle itself, that dark tower upon the Seine, became more than a place. It became a symbol, a stage upon which sin and punishment had been enacted. People spoke of it in hushed tones, saying that by night its stones still whispered with the voices of the princesses, that its shadow upon the river carried the weight of their disgrace. Ballads were sung of knights and princesses undone by love, their verses carried by minstrels from court to tavern, reshaping the tale into song. Each generation added its own embellishments, turning history into legend. In time, playwrights and novelists took up the tale, reimagining it for new audiences. By the Renaissance, the Tour de Nesle affair had become a subject of fascination for dramatists, who saw in it the perfect blend of passion and tragedy. Later still, in the Romantic era, the scandal was reborn upon the stage, painted with the colours of forbidden love and ruthless vengeance. Alexandre Dumas père, master of turning history into drama, seized upon it in the 19th century, weaving it into a theatrical work where the shadow of the past came alive again for audiences hungry for tales of passion and betrayal. In his hands, the princesses became heroines as much as sinners, the knights became tragic figures, and the court of Philip IV became a place of both grandeur and doom. Thus, what had begun as scandal transformed into art, echoing through literature and theatre, never wholly forgotten. Yet even beyond chronicles and plays, the memory of the affair endured in the very stones of Paris. The tower itself stood for centuries, a ruin upon the banks of the Seine, its walls weathered, its purpose changed, but its name forever tied to scandal. Travelers paused to look at it, guides spoke of its history, and Parisians, passing by, remembered the tale their ancestors had whispered. Even when the tower was eventually destroyed in the 17th century, its legend outlived its stones, its shadow lingering in the imagination of a city that thrives on memory. The affair endured also because it spoke to truths deeper than its details. It was a story of power and desire, of the fragility of even the mightiest dynasties, of the way private sins can unravel public glory. It reminded kings that crowns are not shields against passion, reminded queens and princesses that splendor cannot erase loneliness, reminded knights that loyalty can falter before temptation. It revealed the humanity behind the marble faces of monarchs, showing that even in the most gilded halls, hearts can betray and whispers can destroy. In this sense, it was not merely a scandal of one court, but a parable of power itself, relevant across centuries and kingdoms. As you picture the effigies of Philip IV and his sons in Saint Denis, carved in stone, hands folded in eternal prayer, faces serene as though untouched by life's turbulence, you realize that the marble lies. Beneath those stones rests a dynasty torn by scandal, haunted by curses, extinguished by fate. Their silence conceals the whispers of silk drapes, the secret meetings in towers, the cries of tortured knights, the weeping of imprisoned princesses. The marble pretends to serenity, but memory remembers the truth. And in the echoes of that truth lies the lesson, that splendor is fragile, that iron cannot command the heart, and that even the greatest of dynasties may fall not by sword or siege, but by the hidden frailties of those within. Thus, the Tour de Nesle affair lived on, carried from century to century, not forgotten but reshaped, embroidered like the purses that began it. To some, it was a scandal to condemn. To others, a story to romanticize. To all, it was a tale that revealed the dangerous dance of love and power. And as history drifted into legend, and legend into art, the voices of Margaret, Blanche, Joan, Gautier, and Philippe still whispered faintly in the imagination of France, their echoes lingering where the Seine flows beneath the shadow of memory.